Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Whether you've settled into bed, driving through the night, maybe cooking or quietly working with headphones on, this is your moment to slow down, to step away from the noise, and drift into the slow rhythms of deep time. This is long-form storytelling for tired minds, calm, curious, and just the right amount of nerdy. If this kind of content helps you, whether to fall asleep, to focus, or simply to fill your mind with something better than doom scrolling, consider giving this a like and subscribing. It's the simplest way to help more curious humans discover this space, a quiet little corner of the internet where knowledge still wins. And if you ever happen to drift off during one of the chapters, don't worry, I've placed timestamps in the description, so tomorrow you can pick the story back up exactly where you left it, because trust me, this story is worth hearing all the way to the end. And tell me, what do you use this for? Are you listening before bed, while driving, while showering, or sneaking a little prehistory into your workday? Or maybe, what time and place are you listening from tonight? Either way, thank you for being here. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. To a tiny fossil, no bigger than a child, who walked upright long before the mind caught up. A skeleton that rewrote the story of what it means to be human. It is the 24th of November, 1974, a dry, silent morning in the Afar Depression of Ethiopia. A landscape older than any kingdom, older than any myth, just endless sediment, sun-baked hills, and the ghostly trace of rivers long vanished. And it is here, after 3 million years of silence, that something impossible is about to happen. Donald Johanson is crouched in the rubble, a paleoanthropologist barely in his 30s, young enough to still believe that luck could be part of science. His eyes scan the dusty slope, not searching for anything specific. Because the truth is, in this line of work, no one really knows what they are looking for, only that they are looking for bone, for meaning, for some small rebellion against the oblivion that time usually guarantees. And then, in a moment so quiet it barely seems real, his gaze catches on something small, a curved piece of bone, pale against the rust-colored ground. He picks it up, turns it in his hand. An elbow. Not just any elbow, but unmistakably hominin. The hinge of an ancient arm that once swung not just from branch to branch, but perhaps down on the ground. They look up the slope, and there, unbelievably, is more. A jaw, ribs, vertebrae, pieces of a pelvis. And something extraordinary begins to take shape. Not a skull, not a lone tooth, but fragments of an entire body. By the end of that day, and in the weeks that follow, 47 pieces are collected. Together they make up about 40% of a single skeleton, the most complete hominin fossil ever found at the time, the oldest of its kind anyone had ever seen, roughly 3,200,000 years old, a miracle by any measure of paleontology. They named her Lucy, a name that floated out of the evening air, from a Beatles song playing back at camp, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a name born more of celebration than ceremony. The scientific name would come later, Australopithecus afarensis. But it was Lucy the world would remember. And here is the strange part. This fossil, this tiny cluster of bones, did more than rewrite a few chapters in textbooks. It changed the very frame of the story. It stood as quiet, fossilized proof that walking came before thinking. That long before fire, language, or tools, one fragile lineage had stood upright. A simple act, and yet one that rewired the entire direction of our evolutionary future. But before we get to that part, the meaning, it is worth asking a more humble question, a quieter question. What are the actual odds that this fossil exists at all? What has to happen, in the physics of death, dirt, and time, for a living body to become a fossil? Because here is the hard truth about the fossil record. Almost no one makes it in. When an animal dies, especially on dry land, its body does not become a fossil. It is disassembled almost instantly. Scavengers, insects, bacteria, wind, flesh becomes food, bones become fragments. and the ground, for all its silence, does not preserve so much as it erases. To become a fossil, Lucy had to die in just the right place, close enough to water that flood sediments could bury her quickly, far enough from open exposure that weather could not scatter her remains. Her bones had to be covered before decay finished its work, before hyenas could scatter them, before beetles could hollow them out. She had to fall into a riverbed or be caught in a sudden flood. She had to be sealed away, pressed under layers of ash, mud, or silt, and held there, not for centuries, not for thousands of years, but for over 3 million. And even then, she had to survive geology, the shattering force of earthquakes, the grinding of tectonic plates, the chemical corrosion of groundwater, all the countless ways that time normally eats bone. And if that was not unlikely enough, her burial site then had to rise. Erosion had to peel away the upper crust of earth just enough to expose her bones, just enough, but not too much. Had the wind blown one layer deeper, she might have been destroyed. Had the sediment held one layer thicker, she would have stayed hidden forever. And then someone had to be looking, at precisely the right hour, on precisely the right slope. A young anthropologist with no idea that history was about to pivot under his feet. The odds, by any sane calculation, are astronomically close to zero. And yet, here she is. Or rather, here she was. But Lucy's story is not just about luck. It is about what she represents. Because when her bones were cleaned, measured, and compared, something undeniable emerged from the data. Her pelvis was wide, bowl-shaped, the architecture of an upright walker. Her femur angled inward, a crucial design for balancing on 2 feet. Her spine curved, redistributing weight over the hips. Her knee could lock straight. Her ankle was stable for heel-to-toe walking. All of it added up to one thing: bipedalism. She walked, she stood, and she did it long before anyone had expected, long before fire, before tools, before anything that looked like a modern brain. At the time of her discovery, this overturned one of the lingering assumptions left over even from Darwin's time, that big brains, tool use, and upright walking had evolved together as a package deal. But Lucy proved that was not the case. Our ancestors stood before they thought. They walked before they spoke. Bipedalism came first. Her brain, in fact, was still chimpanzee-sized, somewhere between 350 to 500 cubic centimeters, not much bigger than a modern ape, and yet her legs carried the blueprint of everything that would come next. And so this is where the story pivots, from the miracle of discovery to the meaning behind it. Lucy was not the first biped on Earth. That story stretches further back, perhaps to 4 million years ago or more, with ancestors like Ardipithecus ramidus and Australopithecus anamensis. But she was the clearest window at the time, the most complete proof that by 3.2 million years ago, our lineage was fully committed to life on the ground. Still, Lucy was not quite fully human. Not yet. Her arms were long, much longer in proportion than ours. Her curved fingers suggest she still climbed trees, perhaps to sleep or forage. Her rib cage was conical, ape-like. Her face projected forward. Her jaw was heavy. She was a mosaic, part ground walker, part tree climber. And this raises another question. Why walk at all? Why trade the safety of the trees for the risks of the open ground? Some theories suggest energy efficiency. Walking on 2 legs uses far fewer calories than knuckle walking. Others point to freed hands, allowing early hominins to carry food, infants, or tools. Some suggest it was about visibility, standing taller to spot predators on the savanna. Others argue it was about thermoregulation, less surface area exposed to the harsh African sun. Perhaps it was all of these. Perhaps it was none. As honest scientists, we can only say what the evidence allows, for now. What we do know is this. Lucy was part of a species, Australopithecus afarensis, that thrived across East Africa for nearly 1 million years, from about 3.7 to 3 million years ago. Fossils have been found not just in Hadar, but in Latoli, Dakika, and other sites across Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Kenya. She was small, barely over 1 meter tall, maybe 28 kilograms. She lived in mixed environments, open grasslands, wooded patches, river valleys. She ate fruits, leaves, maybe roots and tubers, possibly even small amounts of meat, though the evidence there is still debated. And sometime, on a day no different than any other, something happened. Maybe she fell. Maybe a predator struck. Maybe a flood swept her body away. Whatever it was, her life ended. But her story, through the impossible physics of sediment, chance, and time, did not. And so we arrive here. A single morning in 1974. A slope in Ethiopia. A man squinting against the sun. A fragment of elbow, pale against red dust. And the beginning of one of the most important scientific stories ever told. The story of a fossil that stands for all of us. And as we leave this chapter, one question quietly lingers. If Lucy walked before the mind caught up, before language, before fire, what exactly does that say about how humanity began? Was the first step truly the first spark? Or was it something else? In the next chapter, we follow the footprints, literally. A trail left in volcanic ash nearly 3.7 million years ago. Footprints that show us exactly how they walked and hint at the social lives of our earliest upright kin. We walk forward from here. Let's start with a simple truth. Nature is not a historian. The planet does not keep archives for the sake of posterity. 99.999% of everything that has ever breathed, crawled, swum, or stood beneath the sky has vanished without a trace. Not because they were insignificant, not because their lives were meaningless, but because the very act of becoming a fossil is an act of winning a lottery so impossibly rigged, it borders on the absurd. For every creature that has ever walked the earth, nearly all have returned to it in the same way. Skin to scavengers, flesh to insects, bone to the slow, quiet grind of wind, water, and time. The earth is a master of recycling, and so, when we find the bones of a single tiny upright walker named Lucy, sealed in the sediment for more than 3 million years, we are not merely looking at a skeleton. We are looking at a statistical miracle, a defiance of oblivion. But how does this happen? How does one life, out of billions, dodge the natural eraser of time? And what invisible dice had to roll in just the right way to preserve her story while the rest of her world vanished into dust? It begins, paradoxically, with death. And not just any death. A very particular kind of death in a very particular place at a very particular moment. Imagine the African landscape of the late Pliocene, somewhere between 3 million and 3,700,000 years ago. Not a lush jungle, but a patchwork of open grasslands, scattered woodlands, and slow winding rivers. A place where Australopithecus afarensis like Lucy thrived, walking upright but still climbing trees when needed, threading their existence between ground and canopy. When Lucy died, however that happened, her body faced the same grim fate as nearly every animal that had ever perished in the open. In the absence of special conditions, the odds were simple. Her flesh would feed scavengers, her bones would crack beneath the weight of trampling feet, and within weeks to months, nothing recognizable would remain. Then the rains would come, the soil would churn, the seasons would roll forward, and whatever fragments were left would fade into the anonymous sediment of time. But this did not happen. Instead, her body fell somewhere near a stream or floodplain, somewhere that the water was not too violent to scatter her, but active enough to bury her. And this precise Goldilocks balance, is the first critical step in the making of a fossil. Sedimentation, a gentle yet urgent covering, fine-grained silt, ash from distant volcanoes, or muddy runoff, flowing just thickly enough to cloak the fragile scaffolding of her skeleton before weather, wind, or teeth could claim it. No scavengers tore it apart. No flood carried it downstream. No drought exposed it to the bleaching sun. For reasons still partly speculative, her body remained intact just long enough to be sealed by the earth's soft, shifting skin. But burial is only the beginning. The next chapter in this improbable journey is the slow chemical negotiation between bone and earth, the process we call mineralization. Inside every bone is a lattice of organic collagen and a framework of mineral crystals, primarily hydroxyapatite. Once buried, groundwater, rich with dissolved minerals like silica, iron, or calcium carbonate, seeps through the sediments. Over thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years, the organic components of the bone slowly decay. In their place, minerals precipitate out of the water and crystallize inside the microscopic pores and voids. The bone becomes less bone and more stone. It preserves its shape, but not its substance. This, too, is an unforgiving process. Too much groundwater flow and the bone dissolves entirely. Too little, and it remains organic, doomed to eventual decay. The sediment chemistry must be just right, neutral or slightly alkaline, not too acidic. Temperature matters. So does pressure. A delicate alchemy that most bones fail to survive. Even then, the story teeters on a knife's edge. Geological time is not static. The crust of the earth shifts. Tectonic forces tilt, fold, and crack the sedimentary layers. Erosion carves away ancient deposits. Volcanoes bury some landscapes in protective ash while annihilating others with molten fire. Most fossils, even those lucky enough to form, are eventually destroyed, ground to dust by the relentless tectonic engine of the planet. It is sobering to remember that the bones of Lucy, the tiny scaffolding of her hips, her ribs, her jaw, spent more than 3 million years not as a skeleton, but as a buried memory inside a block of sediment, sealed in the geology of Hadar, neither seen nor known, waiting without knowing it was waiting. And then comes the final miracle: exposure. For a fossil to enter the story of science, it must first escape the story of stone. Erosion must carefully remove the overburden, the heavy cloak of younger sediments that have piled atop it over millions of years. But it cannot be too aggressive. A landslide would smash it. A flood could scatter it. What is needed is the slow, meticulous work of wind, rain, and time, peeling back the layers without disturbing the fragile relic buried inside. In Lucy's case, this process was helped by the unique geology of the Afar Triangle. This part of East Africa sits atop a tectonic rift, a place where the African plate is quite literally tearing itself apart. Over millions of years, this tearing opened valleys, exposed sedimentary basins, and lifted ancient layers to the surface. The very forces that fractured the earth also lifted its memories closer to the daylight. And yet, even now, the bones are not found. They are merely made findable. This is the final gauntlet, the one that spans not geological time, but human time. Somewhere, at some unknowable moment, the dust shifts. A rib fragment breaks through the surface. An afternoon breeze uncovers the curve of a thigh bone, but it remains unnoticed, invisible to anyone not trained, or not lucky, enough to know what they're seeing. And so we arrive in the year 1974, a warm day in November, a narrow ravine in the desert of Hadar, two humans, Donald Johanson and Tom Gray, walking through the baked sediment, looking not for ancestors, but for antelope bones. And then, a glint, an elbow fragment, a glimpse of something impossibly small against the vastness of Earth's deep time. What are the odds? Let's be honest, they are laughably bad, absurdly bad. For every individual who ever lived, only a microscopic fraction has fossilized. Of those, only a fraction are from hominins. Of those, only a fraction are complete enough to tell us anything useful. Of those, only a fraction have been exposed by erosion in a time frame that overlaps with the brief, flickering presence of modern paleontology, a discipline less than 2 centuries old. And of those, only a fraction are ever noticed by human eyes before being eroded away once again. This is why Lucy matters. Not because she was the only Australopithecus afarensis, not because she was the most important individual of her time, but because she is one of the extraordinarily rare survivors of the geological lottery of memory, a whisper from 3,200,000 years ago that somehow evaded the fate that erased almost everyone she ever knew. And in that whisper is not just a story about her. It is a story about us, about the impermanence of everything, about the strange, improbable, fragile nature of memory, not the kind that lives in brains, but the kind that lives in stone. Every fossil, in a sense, is a failed attempt by nature to forget. But nature almost always wins. And so, the bones of Lucy remind us of the odds, of how easily everything vanishes, of how improbable it is that we know anything at all about who we are and where we come from, and of how precious every fragment truly is. Because most lives, including nearly all of our ancestors, are never remembered. Except this one. She was lucky. Or maybe we were. And it is that luck that brought her to the surface. That brought her into the hands of science. And that made it possible for us to sit here, across time, whispering back. From 3,200,000 years ago to 1974. From bone to stone to memory. All right, get comfortable, because this one starts not in Africa, but in the cluttered, book-filled office of one man, a man whose quiet musings would ignite a global argument that is, in many ways, still happening today. His name, of course, was Charles Darwin, and in the year 1859, he published On the Origin of Species, a book that quietly whispered something terrifying to the Victorian world, that life was not fixed, that species were not immutable, and that, most unsettling of all, humans were not an exception. But Darwin was cautious. In that book, he barely mentioned humans. Just one sentence, buried deep in the text, like a fossil waiting to be noticed. It said, simply, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." Nothing more. He knew that to say it plainly, that humans had evolved, would be dynamite. And he was right. 12 years later, in 1871, Darwin finally cracked the door open fully with The Descent of Man. There, for the first time, he laid out the scandalous suggestion that humans were simply another branch on the great tree of life, that we were kin to the apes, that somewhere, buried in the sands of time, there must be fossils of creatures halfway between them and us. But there was a problem. No one had found them. By the late 19th century, despite all the confidence in evolutionary theory, the fossil record of human ancestry was embarrassingly empty. Europe had a handful of curious skull fragments, like the Neanderthal skeleton found in Germany in 1856, but it was poorly understood and widely dismissed at the time. It was only decades later that Neanderthals were recognized as ancient humans. Then came the first real shakeup. In 1891, a Dutch physician named Eugène Dubois, hunting through the steaming jungles of Java, unearthed what he called Pithecanthropus erectus, the Java man, a creature that was confusing, with a skull cap larger than an ape's but smaller than a human's, and a femur that walked upright. It was a tantalizing clue, but it wasn't enough. For the first half of the 20th century, the search for human origins was strangely centered not in Africa, but in Asia and Europe. It seems obvious now, but back then, the assumption was that humans came from wherever the scientists were, and the scientists were in Europe. Even worse, the field became mired in fraud. In 1912, the infamous Piltdown Man was announced in England, a supposed missing link with a big brain and an ape-like jaw. The British scientific establishment loved it. It fit their biases perfectly: brains before bodies, civilization before savagery. But Piltdown was a hoax, a crude mashup of a human skull and an orangutan jaw, stained to look ancient. And yet, it fooled the scientific world for 40 years. Meanwhile, in the real fossil beds of Africa, the truth was quietly waiting. In 1924, a schoolboy in Tong, South Africa, stumbled upon a curious skull embedded in a block of rock. The fossil was sent to Raymond Dart, a young anatomist. What he saw shocked him: a small ape-like face, but with a human-like hole at the base of the skull, indicating upright walking. This was Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa. Dart was ecstatic. The missing link had arrived. But the scientific community was not. European scientists dismissed it. Too small, too primitive. Surely this was just a dumb ape. And besides, they were still nursing the illusion of Piltdown's big-brained ancestor. It would take decades, and a new generation, to shift the view. By the 1950s, the center of gravity in human origins research was moving, quietly but steadily, away from Europe, toward East Africa. In 1959, at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, Mary Leakey discovered Zinjanthropus boisei, now known as Paranthropus boisei. With a massive jaw and flaring cheekbones, this creature looked nothing like the noble ancestors imagined in Piltdown fantasies. But it was real, and it was old. Even more shocking was what followed in 1964. Lewis and Mary Leakey announced the discovery of Homo habilis, the handy man, a species with a larger brain and simple stone tools. For the first time, the genus Homo was pushed back to nearly 2 million years ago. But questions remained. How had we gotten there? Where were the fossils that showed the steps before Homo? In the 1960s and 70s, the fossil floodgates opened further, this time around Lake Turkana in Kenya. Richard Leakey, son of Lewis and Mary, led expeditions uncovering skulls that pushed the timeline further and further back. But still, the picture was fragmented. And then came 1974, a year that would change everything. Out in the baked sediments of Hadar, Ethiopia, a young paleoanthropologist named Donald Johanson stumbled upon a small fragment of elbow bone. Nothing remarkable, until he realized what it was. As he scanned the slope, more pieces appeared: a lower jaw, a femur, ribs, vertebrae, bones that had waited more than 3 million years beneath layers of ash and silt. By the end of the day, Johanson knew what he had found. Not just a bone, but a skeleton. A glimpse at an entire body frozen in deep time. It was, at that point, the oldest and most complete hominin skeleton ever found. And when the team returned to camp that night, jubilant, exhausted, slightly delirious, the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing, and so she was named Lucy. But naming her was the easy part. The hard part was rewriting everything we thought we knew. Because Lucy walked upright, that much was clear from her pelvis and femur, but her brain? No larger than a chimpanzee's. This simple fact overturned decades of assumption that our big brains had come first. They hadn't. The body stood up long before the mind caught up. For the first time, the story of human evolution was not centered on Europe, not Asia, but Africa. And it was not a story of brains before bipedalism. It was a story of bodies adapting first to a changing world, standing upright to walk the savannas, to carry food, to see over tall grasses, and only much later did brains follow. Lucy became the poster child for this revelation. Her species, Australopithecus afarensis, walked upright more than 3 million years ago, and with her came the realization that the road to humanity was longer, messier, and stranger than anyone had imagined. But of course, there were still gaps, big ones. Lucy was no final answer. If anything, she was an invitation, a challenge to look further back, to ask, if Lucy walked, who walked before her? And that is where the story goes next. It is one of the quiet tragedies of science that sometimes the truth can be sitting right in front of us, and yet nobody looks, nobody asks, nobody expects it to be there. And for much of the early history of paleoanthropology, the science of human origins, the continent of Africa was exactly that, a vast, unexamined truth, a memory buried in plain sight. Today it is almost unthinkable. If you ask any schoolchild where humans come from, they will likely point to Africa, the mother continent, the cradle of humankind. But that certainty is a recent invention. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the scientific consensus was rooted somewhere else entirely. Europe, Asia, anywhere but the place it actually belonged. How did we get it so wrong for so long? And why did it take until the mid-20th century, almost half a century after the publication of On the Origin of Species, for the gaze of science to finally shift back to Africa? This is a story about the blind spots of culture, about how even science, for all its methods and its rigor, can fall victim to the same assumptions, biases, and egos as any other human endeavor. It is the story of how a single fossil skull, chipped from the rocks of South Africa in the year 1924, started a chain reaction that would eventually lead, half a century later, to the discovery of Lucy. But it is also the story of how much resistance, skepticism, and doubt had to be overcome along the way. For most of the 19th century, the idea of human evolution was itself still radioactive. Even after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in the year 1859, he avoided writing publicly about human origins for over a decade. In fact, when he finally did broach the subject, in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, he did so almost reluctantly, The evidence was simply too thin. No fossils, no skeletons. Only the unsettling suspicion that the human lineage must be older, stranger, and more complicated than anyone was prepared to accept. By the late 19th century, what few fossils there were came not from Africa, but from Europe and Asia. Neanderthal skeletons had been unearthed in Germany. The so-called Java man, later recognized as Homo erectus, was discovered by Eugene Dubois in Indonesia in the 1890s. Piltdown Man, an infamous hoax that combined a human skull with an orangutan jaw, would not be exposed until the 1950s. But for decades, it anchored the mistaken belief that the earliest humans must have had large brains from the beginning, and crucially, that those humans were European. This is where the story begins to bend. Because in the year 1924, in the limestone caves of Tong, South Africa, a fossil came to light that refused to fit the script. It was a tiny skull, child-sized, with a small brain no bigger than a chimpanzee's, but with a very un-chimpanzee-like feature. The placement of the foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, was at the base, not the back. This creature, whatever it was, had held its head upright. It had walked on two legs. The man who recognized what this meant was an anatomist named Raymond Dart, and he knew instantly what he had found. A bipedal ape, an ancient cousin of humanity. He named it Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa. But Dart's announcement was met not with celebration, but with ridicule. The British scientific establishment, still enchanted by the false promise of Piltdown, dismissed the idea that the cradle of humankind could be anywhere outside of Europe. In their eyes, Africa was a biological backwater, a place of wildlife, not prehistory. For the next 30 years, Dart's fossil would sit in scientific purgatory, too strange to be fully accepted, too compelling to be entirely ignored. A handful of researchers, most notably the Scottish-born paleontologist Robert Broom, continued to hunt for more evidence in the caves of South Africa, and slowly, the evidence began to mount. More Australopithecus, more hints of an upright walker with a small brain, but it was not enough to change the story, not yet. What did finally tip the scales was not a single fossil, but a shift in where scientists were looking. In the 1930s and 40s, a young couple named Louis and Mary Leakey began excavating the deposits of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 Gorge in what is now Tanzania. It was a desolate place, barren, dry, and yet, layer upon layer of sediment revealed a deep and ancient history, fossil bones, stone tools, and by the early 1960s, the Leakeys would announce the discovery of a new species, Homo habilis, a small-brained human ancestor capable of making tools. This was the turning point, not because Homo habilis was definitively the first human, but because it was proof that Africa held secrets far older than anyone had dared imagine. Suddenly, the Rift Valley was no longer just a geological feature. It was a timeline, a memory trap, a place where the bones of the past were caught in the sedimentary folds of tectonic history. But even then, the shift was not immediate. Throughout the 1960s, debates still raged over whether Asia might yet hold the answers. Fossils from China and Indonesia continued to complicate the story, and there was still resistance, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, to the idea that the origin of humanity could be traced to Africa, a continent still viewed through the lens of colonialism, bias, and intellectual inertia. Then came the 1970s. By now, the momentum had shifted decisively. New dating techniques, especially potassium-argon dating, allowed geologists to pin fossils to volcanic layers with astonishing precision. The Great Rift Valley, with its continuous exposure of sediment spanning millions of years, became the most promising window into early human evolution anywhere on Earth. Expeditions multiplied. Teams from France, the United States, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania descended on the region. And in 1974, one such team, led by Donald Johanson, would stumble across something that would forever change the conversation. But before we get there, it is worth pausing to reflect on how improbable this moment really was. For almost a century, the scientific world had ignored Africa. Not because the evidence was not there, but because the questions were not being asked. The entire field of paleoanthropology had been shaped by cultural assumptions about where human greatness should have begun. In Europe with its cathedrals and museums, or in Asia, with its mysteries and its myths. Africa was a blind spot, not because it was empty of history, but because the minds of those searching were not yet ready to see it. And yet, despite all of that, despite the centuries of oversight and the decades of doubt, the rocks had been waiting, the sediments had been waiting, and somewhere beneath the ancient soils of Hadar, a skeleton had been waiting too, a tiny frame of broken bone, 3,200,000 years old, quietly lying in the sediment, waiting, it seems, for someone to notice. It is humbling, really, to realize that the fossil record is not just a record of life, but a record of where we choose to look. And for most of history, we were not looking in the right place. When the spotlight finally did swing toward Africa, the continent answered with more than anyone expected. Not just Lucy, but Laetoli, with its footprints preserved in volcanic ash. Not just Australopithecus afarensis, but Ardipithecus, Australopithecus anamensis, Kenyanthropus, and a growing catalog of species that shattered the old, linear story of a single straight line from ape to human. Africa was not just the beginning of the human story, it was a whole library of beginnings. Each fossil a page, each discovery a footnote to the vast and branching saga of what it means to be a hominin. And yet, for all that we have found, there is still more that we do not know. More gaps than answers, more questions than conclusions. That is the honest truth of science. And if there is a lesson here, perhaps it is this. The past does not give up its secrets easily. It waits, patiently, quietly, for those willing to ask the right questions and to look in the right places. And so the spotlight shifts, from the caves of South Africa to the open sediments of Ethiopia, from the skull of the Tong child to the bones lying beneath the sands of Hadar. And somewhere in that landscape, a small piece of elbow bone is waiting to be seen. It is almost time for Lucy, but not quite yet. First, we must ask, what exactly was the world she lived in? What forces preserved her bones when almost every other creature vanished without a trace? And how does something as fragile as a skeleton survive for over 3 million years? That, as it happens, is where our next chapter begins. If you could stand where Lucy once stood, somewhere deep in the heart of what is now Ethiopia, you would not recognize the world. But it would feel strangely familiar, a place caught between two destinies, part forest, part grassland, a world not yet fully surrendered to the open savannas of later millennia, nor clinging entirely to the leafy embrace of ancient woodlands. The air here carried the scent of damp earth, acacia blossoms, and the subtle musk of 100 hidden creatures. Beneath your feet, the ground was soft in some places, cracked and sun-baked in others, always shifting, always temporary. This was a landscape shaped by fire, water, wind, and the slow violence of plate tectonics, the restless fracture zone of the Great Rift Valley. The Afar Triangle, 3 million years ago, was no quiet refuge. It was a geological war zone. This is one of the rare places on Earth where the planet is physically pulling itself apart. The African plate and the Arabian plate were, and still are, slowly rifting away from each other, tearing open the crust and forming the long scar we now call the East African Rift. This ancient tectonic wound had consequences. Volcanic eruptions painted the skies red with ash, sometimes for years. Earthquakes rolled through the hills without warning. Lakes expanded and vanished with the rhythms of a shifting climate. And it was within this unstable but fertile chaos that the earliest chapters of our own story were quietly unfolding. Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, did not live alone. Her world was dense with life. Herds of ancient antelope grazed the grassy patches, their shapes both familiar and alien to a modern eye. There were elephant relatives, not quite the elephants we know, but gomphotheres, with straight tusks that jutted forward like a pair of ivory swords. Hippopotamus ancestors wallowed in the rivers, though the rivers themselves often came and went with the seasons. Crocodiles, many more species than today, patrolled the muddy shallows, as patient then as they are now. Predators haunted the edges. Meganterion, the saber-toothed cat, stalked the shrubs, lower to the ground but immensely powerful, built like a leopard on growth hormones. There were hyenas, but not like the bone-crunching scavengers of modern savannas. These were more wolf-like, sometimes more hunter than scavenger. And lurking in the tall grasses or behind the acacia thorns were big cats whose bones are too rare to fully reconstruct, but whose teeth left deep marks on the fossil record of Lucy's kind. And yet, this was not a simple world of predator and prey. The ecology was more nuanced, more layered. It was a mosaic. Tall woodlands blended into grassy floodplains. Riverine forests hugged the streams. Open savannas unfolded into dry scrublands. This patchwork allowed multiple species of hominins, primates, and mammals to coexist, each finding its own ecological niche. Australopithecus afarensis was one of them, and a particularly versatile one. We know from dental microwear, the tiny scratches and pits left on teeth by chewing, that Lucy and her kin were generalists. Their diet was a survival strategy in itself: hard seeds, tough tubers, soft fruits when they could find them, grasses when necessary, perhaps even the occasional scavenged sliver of meat. Carbon isotope analysis of their tooth enamel, essentially a chemical fingerprint of the foods they ate, shows an increasing reliance on foods from open environments like grasses and sedges, but the anatomy of their hands, shoulders, and curved fingers suggests that the trees were never fully abandoned. They walked, but they also climbed. This dual existence, part terrestrial, part arboreal, was not a mark of indecision but of evolutionary success, at least for a while. On the ground, Australopithecus afarensis walked upright. Their pelvises were short and broad, their femurs angled inward, knees locking with each step, stabilizing the body over narrow feet. The Laetoli footprints, dated to nearly 3.7 million years ago in what is now Tanzania, preserve a ghostly record of this. 2, perhaps 3 individuals walking side by side across a patch of wet volcanic ash, their toes aligned, their heels striking first, the weight rolling forward just as ours does today. Yet biomechanical analysis suggests their gait was not quite human. Their knees may have bent slightly more. Their stride was shorter, the motion slightly more waddling, more energy-intensive than ours, but still a marvel of evolutionary engineering. But when danger came, and it often did, the trees were safety. The arms of Australopithecus afarensis remained long relative to their legs, with powerful shoulders and curved fingers better suited for grasping than precision. The discovery of the Dikika child, sometimes called Selam, unearthed in Ethiopia in 2006 and dated to roughly 3.3 million years ago, confirms this. Her shoulder blades are more similar to those of a juvenile gorilla than to any modern human. Whatever else they were, Lucy and her kin were still children of the forest, even as they began to claim the ground. The sounds of Lucy's world were not so different from those that haunt the African plains today. The low grumbling of hippos, the sharp barks of baboons, the distant rumble of elephants, birdsong by the dozens, insects always, and at night the howls of predators, the scurry of small creatures, the rustle of leaves disturbed by something unseen. A world constantly alert, constantly moving, where quiet moments were rare and often meant danger. And then, of course, there were the other apes, not just Lucy's own species. The fossil record hints, though often frustratingly incomplete, that other hominin lineages may have shared this landscape. The Bertel foot, discovered in Ethiopia and dated to roughly 3.4 million years ago, belongs to a creature with an opposable big toe, more adapted to tree climbing than walking. Yet it was alive at the same time as Australopithecus afarensis. Who this mystery ape was remains debated. Perhaps it was Australopithecus diarymeta, described from jaw fragments in nearby sediments. Or perhaps it was another, as yet unknown cousin on our tangled family tree. This pattern of multiple hominin species coexisting would repeat throughout human evolution. There was never a single line, no smooth ladder to modern humanity. Instead, the past was a braided stream of experiments. Some led toward us. Most did not. The Afar ecosystem itself was part of that experiment. Its instability was its genius. As lakes dried and forests gave way to grasslands, species were forced to adapt or disappear. Lucy's kind did both, adapted for a time, then disappeared. By around 3 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis began to vanish from the fossil record. But they left echoes. In species like Australopithecus africanus, in the robust chewing machines known as Paranthropus, and eventually, though the precise pathway remains frustratingly elusive, in the genus Homo, our genus. But if Lucy's world teaches us anything, it is that survival is rarely about dominance. It is about flexibility. It is about finding a way to thrive between the cracks, between forest and grassland, between ground and tree, between the past and the future. The Afar Triangle today is a dry, harsh desert, but when you stand there, it is impossible not to imagine the ghosts of that older world, the hum of insects, the call of distant primates, the crunch of footsteps in wet volcanic ash. And somewhere, among the grasses and the trees, a small, upright ape is walking, not knowing that millions of years later, her bones would rise from this earth to tell the story of us. That world is gone, but it is not forgotten, not as long as we keep asking the question, who were they, and how did they become us? All right, let's step back in time, to a world where survival was never promised, where every sunrise meant another day hunted, and every shadow could be your last. This is East Africa, roughly 3,200,000 years ago, a time when the land smelled of damp earth, crushed grass, and the sour musk of animals, where the air rang with a constant background hum of insects, punctuated by the coughing roars of big cats, the alarm calls of monkeys, and the distant rhythmic grunt of grazing herds. This was the world Lucy inherited, and it was not a gentle one. To imagine the late Pliocene is to erase everything we know about modern Africa. Strip away the highways, the villages, even the landscapes as we know them. The Rift Valley was younger then, still tearing itself open, a scar slowly widening across the skin of the continent. Volcanoes lined the horizon. Ash often blanketed the land. Rivers braided and meandered unpredictably, drying out one year and flooding the next. Lakes would appear, vanish, then reappear somewhere else, chasing tectonic forces none of their inhabitants understood. This was a landscape in flux, but in its chaos, it nurtured life in overwhelming abundance. Grazing animals dominated the open plains. Three-toed horses, ancient relatives of zebras, antelope, and wildebeest. Giant pigs the size of buffalo trotted through the brush. There were elephant relatives, but not the ones we know today. Some were hulking, straight-tusked giants with shovel-like lower jaws. Others were smaller, adapted to forest fringes. The skies above were not safe either. Crowned eagles, larger than any living eagle today, circled on thermals, their keen eyes scanning for movement, for anything small enough to be plucked from the grass and carried screaming into the sky. Paleontologists have evidence that even young Australopithecus, like the famous Tong child, fell victim to birds of prey, their tiny eye sockets bearing the distinctive puncture wounds left by talons. But it was the predators on the ground that posed the greatest risk. The saber-toothed cats of the Pliocene were not myths or exaggerations. Meganterion, a leopard-sized saber-tooth, prowled these lands, its upper canines curved and serrated for ripping open windpipes and slicing through arteries. Unlike modern leopards, it was built stockier, with powerful forelimbs designed not for chasing, but for ambushing, for wrestling prey to the ground in sudden, brutal violence. And then there were the crocodiles. Not just any crocodiles, but several species, some larger than anything alive today. Fossil evidence from East Africa shows crocodilians capable of lunging several meters out of the water, seizing anything, antelope, monkey, Australopithecus, that strayed too close to a riverbank. One moment, a drink. The next, silence, ripples, and the dragging spiral into muddy water. Evidence from fossil sites tells a grim tale. Bones of hominins punctured with crocodile teeth, skulls of early human relatives pierced by the bite of saber-tooths, even tiny skeletons of infants found with fractures and talon marks consistent with eagle predation. Life was precarious, and death was constant. But to survive in a landscape like this, you did not need to be the strongest predator. You simply needed to not be the slowest prey. And this is where the anatomy of Lucy and her species, Australopithecus afarensis, becomes crucial to understand. Australopithecus afarensis was a strange compromise. On one hand, her hips, knees, and feet were clearly adapted for walking upright, This was a creature designed, or rather sculpted by millions of years of evolution, to spend a lot of time on the ground. Walking freed the hands. It allowed her ancestors to carry food, to see over tall grass, to move with greater efficiency than knuckle-walking chimpanzees. But she had not fully abandoned the trees. Her long, curved fingers, her powerful shoulders, more like those of a climbing ape than a ground-dwelling human. Her upper body told a different story, one of an animal still deeply tied to an arboreal past. The trees were not just a memory. They were a refuge. Most likely, Australopithecus lived in a pattern of cautious flexibility. On the ground during the day, foraging for tubers, fruits, and perhaps scavenging the occasional meat, but always keeping an eye on the nearest tree. Because when the grass parted and a shadow lunged, there was no time to hesitate. You either climbed or you died. The open savannas of the Pliocene were hunting grounds sculpted for ambush predators. Unlike the sweeping grasslands of modern-day Serengeti, where cheetahs sprint after gazelle, the late Pliocene was a mosaic. Patches of dense brush, scattered woodlands, and open clearings. Perfect for predators who did not chase, but waited. And yet, it was not just predators that made life difficult. The climate itself was unpredictable. Droughts were common. Lakes shrank and expanded without warning. Food could vanish for weeks at a time. For a small-bodied hominin, standing just over 1 meter tall, weighing around 28 kilograms, the margin for error was vanishingly thin. Paleoecological studies of sediment cores taken from ancient lake beds in the Afar region show cycles of rapid climate shifts. Wet phases followed by sudden dry spells. Every shift forced animals to migrate, to adapt, or to die. In some years, the plains would teem with life. In others, they would become bone-dry deserts, littered with carcasses. And yet, Australopithecus afarensis survived. Not just survived, but thrived. For nearly 1 million years, this species persisted. From around 3.7 million to 3 million years ago, they spread across what is now Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. They were among the most successful hominins ever to walk the earth, outlasting most species that have ever lived, including our own Homo sapiens, which has yet to pass even 500,000 years. So how did they do it? The answer, it seems, lies in flexibility, a willingness to be neither fully ground-dweller nor fully arboreal, to eat whatever the landscape offered. Fossil analysis of tooth enamel shows a surprising dietary range. They ate not just fruits, but grasses, seeds, roots, even tough, fibrous plants that modern apes generally avoid, possibly even the occasional bit of scavenged meat. This adaptability extended to how they navigated risk. Unlike chimpanzees, who often sleep in nests high in the canopy, Lucy's kind may have split their time between ground shelters and trees depending on the threat. A dense thicket offered protection from aerial predators. But when lions, or their ancient equivalents, prowled, the tree was always the fallback. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine the terror of it. To crouch quietly under the acacia, listening to the distant cough of a saber-tooth, hoping the wind does not carry your scent. To watch crocodiles slide silently through the reeds. To glance up at a shadow passing overhead and wonder if it circles for you. But it is just as easy to forget that this world was not merely terrifying. It was also rich. It was home. To live in the late Pliocene was to live among abundance if you knew where to look. To drink from rivers teeming with hippos. To forage beneath fig trees heavy with fruit. To walk among elephants, giraffes, and antelope. To watch flocks of flamingos turn lakes into pink clouds. And to do all this with a mind just beginning to stir toward the spark of something more. A mind that was, in some small ways, already on the path toward becoming us. There is humility in realizing that survival does not require dominion. Lucy's species never conquered this world. They adapted to it. They negotiated with it. They hid when needed, fled when chased, climbed when the ground betrayed them. And in doing so, they persisted for nearly 1 million years. Today, when we look at her bones, at the cracked pieces of a pelvis, or the worn groove of a knee joint, we are not looking at the story of a queen of the savannah. We are looking at the story of survival without mastery, of endurance without power. And in that story, there is something deeply, undeniably human. Because if there is one lesson the Pliocene offers, if there is one truth Lucy's world still whispers to us across 3 million years, it is this: that life is fragile, that memory is fragile, and that in a world surrounded by killers, the only victory that ever mattered was simply being here, alive, for one more day. And somehow, against the odds, a single skeleton managed to survive not just the predators, the floods, the fires, and the scavengers, but also the crushing weight of geological time. A skeleton that now tells this story, her story, and in some strange, beautiful way, ours. In the end, it always comes back to bones, the stubborn survivors of time. Flesh and skin vanish, voices disappear, whole lifetimes are swallowed by the dirt and silence of deep time. But bones, when the universe is feeling generous, linger. They outlast the flesh that grew them. They hold shapes the earth might remember. And once in a geological while, those bones whisper back to the future. Lucy's did. There are only 47 of them, less than half the full count of bones that once held her together. 47 fragments of an upright ape who lived and died over 3 million years ago in what is now the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia. 47 pieces that should, by every mathematical law of probability, have long ago become dust. And yet they remain. Enough to reconstruct a story of what she was, how she moved, and how she reshaped everything we thought we knew about becoming human. Her bones are not just bones. They are blueprints, arguments, statements written in calcium. And the message was loud, clear, and deeply inconvenient to the scientific establishment of the 20th century. Lucy walked. She walked upright, fully, habitually, without compromise, without the half measures of knuckle-walking ancestors, without the awkward in-betweens that many scientists had still expected to find in a creature this ancient. Her bones broke a paradigm. And it starts here, with the pelvis. If there is any single body part that betrays whether an animal walks on 2 legs or 4, it is the pelvis. And Lucy's is definitive. Wide, short, and bowl-shaped. Nothing like the long, narrow pelvis of a chimpanzee designed to accommodate horizontal walking and tree swinging. This was an upright pelvis, engineered to stabilize the trunk while one leg leaves the ground mid-step. Engineered to shift weight cleanly from side to side with each stride in the same pendulum-like motion that modern humans use today. The femur, the upper leg bone, tells the same story. In apes who walk on 4 limbs, the femur points straight down from the hip, but in bipeds, it angles inward, toward the knee. This valgus angle is critical. It brings the feet under the center of gravity, allowing balance on a single foot during each stride. Lucy's femur angles inward, her knees lock. Her stride was not tentative, it was the real thing. Then there is the knee joint itself, a marvel of engineering, flexible enough to permit walking, stable enough to avoid collapse. The lower end of her femur and the upper end of her tibia, the shin bone, fit together in a locking mechanism that enables weight bearing on a single limb at a time. The same locking pattern found in every human knee today. You cannot fake this in evolution. You do not accidentally drift into this design unless your species is walking upright as its primary mode of locomotion. And then the feet. Sadly, Lucy's foot bones are incomplete, but others from her species, Australopithecus afarensis, fill in the gaps. The best example comes not from Ethiopia, but from a trail of footprints pressed into wet volcanic ash in Latoli, Tanzania, around 3,600,000 years ago. The prints are unmistakably bipedal. There is an arch, a forward-pointing big toe in line with the others, a heel strike and toe-off pattern almost indistinguishable from modern humans. Whoever left those prints walked as we do, and it was Lucy's species. All of this matters for one simple reason. Until Lucy, the dominant theory still leaned heavily on the idea that large brains came first, that intelligence drove the shift to walking, that tool use and planning demanded a change in posture, which then reshaped the body. But Lucy's brain was not large. Her cranial capacity was roughly 400 cubic centimeters, barely above that of a chimpanzee. This was not an ape with a large brain learning to walk. This was an upright ape whose brain had not yet caught up. And that was the bombshell. Because it meant that walking was not a consequence of becoming more human. It was a cause. The shift to upright walking preceded the explosion of brain growth by at least 2 million years. Walking was the scaffolding. the evolutionary foundation. It freed hands. It restructured breathing. It changed the energy economy of the entire body, saving calories with each step compared to knuckle-walking primates. And over deep time, those freed calories and freed hands would fuel the next revolutions: tool-making, fire, culture, and finally language. But there is more nuance than that. Lucy was not fully modern. Her arms were still long relative to her legs. Her fingers were still curved, well suited for gripping branches. Her shoulder blades were set high and oblique, hinting at strong climbing abilities. The upper half of her body still spoke the language of the trees. This was not a creature that had fully abandoned the canopy. It was a hybrid, a terrestrial biped who could still climb when needed, perhaps to forage, perhaps to escape, perhaps to sleep in safety above the predators of the savanna. This hybrid design raises a fascinating question. Was walking an adaptation for travel or for survival in a changing landscape? The fossil record tells us that East Africa during Lucy's time was in flux. Forests were shrinking, grasslands were expanding. A patchwork of environments forced adaptability. Bipedalism may not have evolved for running long distances at first. It may have been about moving efficiently between shrinking patches of forest, about surviving in a world where the ground was increasingly as important as the trees. Her teeth add to the story: large molars, thick enamel, a jaw built for heavy chewing, likely not from eating meat, but from processing tough, fibrous plant material, roots, tubers, seeds, and hard fruits that demanded grinding. Her dental wear patterns suggest a flexible diet, another marker of a species navigating a world in flux. Yet even here, the bones are not finished talking. The curvature of the spine, the lumbar lordosis that curves the lower back, is critical. In quadrupeds, the spine is a simple bridge from neck to tail, but in bipeds, it must bend to bring the torso upright over the hips. Lucy's vertebrae show this curvature. Her lower spine had already adapted to the stresses of upright posture. Her sacrum, the triangular bone at the base of the spine, was wide and human-like, helping to anchor that distinctive lumbar curve. And then there is the skull base, a small but crucial detail. Where the skull connects to the spine, the foramen magnum, is a key diagnostic marker of posture. In quadrupeds, it sits toward the back of the skull. In bipeds, it migrates forward, placing the head directly over the spine. Lucy's foramen magnum is forward, her head balanced above her body, another unambiguous signature of bipedality. Put it all together and the message is clear. Lucy was not an ape learning to walk. She was not a transitional experiment. She was part of a lineage fully committed to walking upright, fully adapted to a terrestrial life, fully transformed in the lower half of her body into an upright walker, and yet, still an ape in the trees from the waist up, still an animal straddling two worlds, the old and the new, the arboreal and the terrestrial, the ancient and the future. That is the strange beauty of her design, a creature neither fully ape nor fully human, something in between, something that no longer exists, a version of ourselves that once walked the earth and vanished. And this is where humility must return to the story, because as definitive as these bones seem, science is always provisional. New fossils can change the picture, new footprints, new skeletons. Already, discoveries like the Bertel foot, a partial foot found in Ethiopia with an opposable big toe from the same time period, suggest that not all hominins were walking exactly like Lucy. That evolution was messy, that multiple experiments were happening in parallel. But for now, Lucy remains the clearest window we have into the moment when walking upright stopped being an experiment and became a commitment. When the blueprint of our entire body was rewritten, not for thinking, not for talking, not for fire or tools, but for walking. The skeleton that walked is still walking, through us. Every step you take is borrowed from her. Every stride a quiet echo of a choice made over 3 million years ago. A choice written not in words, but in bones. Bones that the earth should have forgotten, but for reasons we still barely understand, did not. And the next question, of course, is this. If walking came first, what came next? It is perhaps one of the strangest truths in the fossil record, that for more than 3 million years there existed something that was neither ape nor human. A creature whose bones defy the categories that every textbook, every museum, and every curious mind tries to neatly draw between what is animal and what is us. Australopithecus afarensis, a species suspended between worlds, and for nearly a century we did not even know it existed. When Lucy's bones were first pulled from the sediment of Hadar in 1974, the headlines were simple. She was our ancestor, the missing link, the first walker, the beginning of everything. But the truth, like the ground her bones were buried in, turned out to be layered, messy. Not a clean line from ape to human, but a braided stream, a mosaic of traits that evolved at different speeds, under different pressures, and in different orders than anyone had expected. So what was Lucy really? Was she a failed prototype, an evolutionary experiment destined to vanish? Or was she the critical bridge between two worlds, carrying the last whisper of an arboreal past and the first footprint of a terrestrial future? The answer, as always in paleoanthropology, is complicated. Start with the skull. Look at it from the back and it tells one story. A tiny brain case, domed but small, no larger than a modern chimpanzee's. Around 400 cubic centimeters, give or take. This is not the skull of a thinker, not the cranium of a toolmaker or a storyteller or a species with any hint of what we might one day become. If you were to look only at the brain, you would not place her on our branch of the family tree. You would walk past her in the fossil record and think, primitive. Done. Nothing here. But pivot the skull. Look at the base. The foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord exits the skull, does not sit at the rear like it does in apes. It is tucked forward, underneath. That simple shift tells us that the head sat balanced atop an upright spine. This is not an animal walking on four limbs. This is a creature whose posture aligned with the gravity of the earth in the same way yours does right now. The head atop the neck atop the spine atop the pelvis above the knees above the feet. A column of balance designed not for climbing, though she still could, but for walking. Move next to the teeth, a mouth that speaks in bone. Her canines are reduced, much smaller than those of chimpanzees. The sexual dimorphism, the difference between male and female canine size, is muted compared to most apes. Her molars are broad, her enamel thick, designed for grinding, for a diet not of meat, but of tough plant matter, roots, tubers, grasses, fruits. And yet the jaw juts forward in a way still unmistakably ape-like. Prognathism, as the scientists call it. A face that projects, not one that has yet flattened into the vertical planes of the genus Homo. But the real revelation, the anatomy that screamed at science, was in the pelvis. A wide, bowl-shaped pelvis, flared to the sides, shortening the distance between the sacrum and the hip sockets. The shape stabilizes the upper body over the legs. The ilium curves around in a way that anchors muscles for bipedal walking. This was no climbing pelvis. This was a walking pelvis. A pelvis that demanded the sacrifice of speed, of sprinting quadruped motion, in favor of efficiency on two legs. And yet, directly below it, the femur angles inward, a valgus knee. This places the feet closer to the midline of the body, keeping the center of gravity balanced while walking. Look further down, and the tibia, the shin bone, tells the same story. The ankle joint locks in a way adapted for weight bearing on flat ground. The feet, though sadly not preserved in Lucy herself, are known from other Australopithecus fossils. They bear an arch, a shock absorber for walking, and a non-divergent big toe, fully in line with the others, no longer grasping for branches. But then the contradiction returns. Look at the arms, long, in fact proportionally much longer than ours. The humerus and radius suggest that the upper limbs retained the strength and flexibility of life in the trees. Her shoulder blade, at least when studied from the specimen known as Selam, the Dinkinesh child, retains the upward-facing glenoid fossa typical of animals who climb. Her fingers are long and curved, designed not just for manipulation, but for gripping branches. Her ribcage flares outward, forming a conical shape more similar to apes, allowing for a larger gut to process fibrous plant matter. It is, in a word, a mosaic. A body that does not belong cleanly to one world or the other. An upright walker, yes. A biped by necessity, by design, by survival. But also a climber. an animal that still sought refuge in the trees at night, away from the crocodiles, the saber-toothed cats, and the leopards that ruled the ground. The real revolution in understanding Australopithecus is not that they were the first bipeds. The evidence now shows that bipedalism itself likely emerged earlier. Fossils like Ardipithecus ramidus, dating to around 4.5 million years ago, show partial adaptations to upright walking, even while retaining more arboreal traits. Even earlier candidates like Sahelanthropus from Chad, dated to around 7 million years ago, have been argued, though controversially, to show upright posture based on the position of the foramen magnum. What makes Australopithecus afarensis different, what made Lucy different, is that for the first time, bipedalism was not partial, not occasional, not an awkward compromise between ground and tree. It was habitual, obligatory, the default setting. Lucy's species committed to walking as the primary mode of movement, and in doing so, it set the stage for everything that followed. And yet, it raises an uncomfortable question. If Lucy was so well adapted to her world, if she could walk, climb, forage, and thrive, then why did she vanish? Why did Australopithecus afarensis, a species that survived for nearly 1 million years, eventually disappear without a trace? The answer may lie in the very thing that made her so successful. Adaptation to a specific environment is a double-edged sword. East Africa during the late Pliocene was dynamic. Climate swings were frequent. Wet periods alternated with dry. Forests gave way to grasslands, then forests returned, then grasslands again. A species that is a generalist, able to walk, to climb, to eat a wide variety of foods, can survive for a long time, but only up to a point. By around 2.9 million years ago, the environment was shifting yet again, and with it came the rise of new hominin species. Australopithecus africanus in the south, Paranthropus, the robust Australopiths, with their massive jaws and specialized diets, and then the genus Homo, our genus, a lineage that would take the upright body plan and pair it with something Lucy never had, a rapidly expanding brain. This is where the debate sharpens. Was Australopithecus afarensis a direct ancestor of Homo, or a side branch? The answer, frustratingly, remains unresolved. Many paleoanthropologists argue that the timing, geography, and anatomy make her the most likely candidate. Others point to fossils like Kenyanthropus platyops or Australopithecus diarrhemeta as possible alternatives, hints that East Africa may have hosted multiple hominin lineages at once, any one of which could have given rise to us. And then there is the reality of the fossil record itself. It is not a book with every page intact. It is a scattering of torn sentences, eroded paragraphs, and missing chapters. There are no birth certificates in deep time, no family trees with names neatly written in ink, only bones, broken, scattered, and battered by millions of years of geology, erosion, and chance. What we do know, what Lucy's bones scream across 3 million years, is that the divide between ape and human was never a clean break. Evolution did not draw a line. It built a bridge. A wobbly, improvised bridge, constructed piece by piece over hundreds of thousands of years. Lucy stood on that bridge. Not yet us. No longer them. Something in between. If you were to look into her eyes, you would see neither a chimpanzee nor a human reflected back. You would see a world in transition. A body learning to walk before it could think. A species learning to stand before it could speak. You would see the first step, not metaphorically, but literally, that carried the weight of everything to come. And then, like all things in deep time, she was gone. Her lineage faded, her bones buried, her story forgotten for 3 million years, until a chance glance on a dusty slope in Hadar, Ethiopia, in the year 1974, brought her back into the light. Not just as a fossil, but as a symbol of what it means to be a creature forever caught between what we were and what we are. There is something profoundly strange about the fact that you are sitting or lying or walking or driving, listening to this because of a single irreversible decision made by a few ancient apes more than 3 million years ago. The choice to stand. Not figuratively, literally. A species that was perfectly capable of climbing, crouching, and swinging through trees began doing something that, from the outside, looks like a terrible idea. They stood up. They left the safety of branches. They walked. Not just occasionally, not just in emergencies, but habitually, every day, all the time, on 2 feet. No other ape did this. No other primate risked everything on this gamble, the gamble of walking upright. And to this day, no one, not even the best minds in science, can fully agree on why. What could possibly drive a perfectly good tree-climbing ape to abandon the canopy and commit, for better or worse, to life on the ground? Because once you stand, there is no going back. From around 4 million to 2,800,000 years ago, something in East Africa began to shift. We can trace the outlines of that shift today in a strange pattern of bones, footprints, and fossils scattered from the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia to Latoli in Tanzania. The species we call Australopithecus afarensis, the species that Lucy belongs to, was not the first to experiment with walking, but it was the one that committed. Fully, stubbornly, irreversibly. Her kind were not dabblers in bipedalism. They were specialists. By the time Lucy lived, around 3,200,000 years ago, her species had been walking for hundreds of thousands of years. They were no longer apes who sometimes stood. They were walkers who sometimes climbed. But here is the strange part. They did this with brains no bigger than a modern chimpanzee's. There was no complex language, no grand plans, no fire, no weapons, no cities, just tiny brains perched on bodies that had decided, for reasons still debated, that walking was the future. When we try to imagine why this happened, we are staring into one of the deepest mysteries of human evolution. The fossil record hints at possible answers, but there is no consensus. Some scientists argue that a changing climate drove it. Around 3 million to 4 million years ago, the lush forests of East Africa began to fragment. Dense canopies shrank. Open woodlands and grassy savannas expanded. In this changing world, creatures who could move efficiently across long stretches of open land had an edge. On 2 legs, Australopithecus could see farther over tall grasses. They could scan for predators, and maybe even for food. Others argue it was about energy. Walking upright, strange as it seems, uses less energy than walking on 4 legs, at least over long distances. In an environment where food was patchy and survival required constant movement, energy efficiency was survival. A few anatomical shifts, the tilting of the pelvis, the angling of the femur, the reshaping of the foot, could have unlocked a huge evolutionary payoff. Less energy spent, more calories saved. But none of this fully explains the risk. Standing upright is biomechanically weird. It narrows the birth canal, making childbirth harder and more dangerous. It weakens the lower back, introducing new vulnerabilities. It makes you slower to accelerate than a 4-legged runner. And it commits you to a world where the nearest tree might be too far away when something with claws or fangs decides you look like lunch. Evolution rarely favors losers. And yet, by most intuitive measures, walking upright looks, at first glance, like a losing bet. And still, it stuck. More than that, it became the foundation for everything that followed. Because bipedalism is not just a mode of movement, it is a gateway. Once your hands are free, no longer needed for walking, they can do other things. They can carry, they can throw, they can shape, they can build. Walking, in a strange way, is the reason you are holding a phone right now, or sitting at a desk, or standing in a kitchen stirring a pot. Bipedalism liberated the upper limbs, and everything flowed from that. Stone tools, spears, fire, art, eventually, spaceships. But all of that was still unimaginably far away in Lucy's time. Her people, the walkers of the late Pliocene, were not thinking about the future. They were thinking about lunch and survival, because the world they inherited was not built for walkers. It was built for killers. The fossil record tells us this in no uncertain terms. Crocodiles longer than cars haunted the rivers. Saber-toothed cats, leopard-like ambush predators with jaw muscles engineered for crushing bone, stalked the grass. Giant birds, some capable of preying on small mammals, patrolled the skies. And the bones of Australopithecus themselves tell the story. Fossilized jaws of their cousins, Paranthropus, show puncture marks from big cats. A juvenile Australopith skull from South Africa reveals talon marks from an eagle, which likely snatched it straight off the ground. In this world, being small, and Lucy was just over 1 meter tall, was a liability. Walking made you faster over distance, but it did not make you safe. And yet the walkers thrived. They spread from Ethiopia to Kenya to Tanzania, and perhaps even as far west as Chad. Over nearly 1 million years, Australopithecus afarensis left enough fossil evidence that we can, today, reconstruct their evolutionary success. But their success raises an uncomfortable question. Was bipedalism really an innovation or a mistake? Some paleoanthropologists have called it the most consequential maladaptation in primate history, because walking created new problems as fast as it solved old ones. The human spine, twisted into an S-curve to balance the weight of the head and torso, is prone to collapse. Herniated discs, pinched nerves, scoliosis. Our knees and hips, twisted to keep the center of gravity stable, are vulnerable to arthritis and injury. Our feet, evolved for walking long distances on relatively soft ground, are now forced to carry us on concrete, leading to a worldwide epidemic of back pain, knee pain, and plantar fasciitis. In some ways, we are still paying the price for the decision Lucy's ancestors made. But calling it a mistake may miss the point. Evolution does not plan. It does not engineer. It does not test prototypes in a lab and discard the failures. It throws mutations into the world like dice. Most fail, some stick. And when they stick, when they survive long enough to pass on their genes, evolution doubles down. Walking was not a masterstroke. It was an accident that worked. And once it worked, it set the stage for everything else. Because once you stand, the hands are free. And once the hands are free, the brain, eventually, has to catch up. Not immediately, not in Lucy's time. Her brain was still the size of an orange, but the seeds were planted. Over the next million years, the descendants of Australopithecus would begin experimenting with tools, with hunting, with fire, and eventually, with bigger brains. But none of that was inevitable. If you rewind the clock to 3 million years ago, nothing about Lucy's world suggests that her lineage is destined to become anything special. In fact, most lineages of bipedal apes went extinct. Australopithecus afarensis eventually disappeared. Other upright walkers, Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus 𝐓𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐒, Kenyanthropus platyops, emerged and vanished. The genus Homo, the one we belong to, is a late experiment in this ongoing evolutionary gamble, and it may prove just as temporary. Still, when we look back at the footprints left at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, those fragile depressions in volcanic ash preserved for nearly 3,700,000 years, we are looking at the moment the gamble became real. A line of small hominins walking together, a larger one in front, a smaller one trailing behind, stepping into the footprints of the one before. A family, a pair of mates, a mother and child? We will never know. But those footprints are the echo of the moment when standing upright stopped being a possibility and became destiny. It is humbling to realize that if you could step back into that world, the late Pliocene of East Africa, you would not see the future. You would not recognize destiny unfolding. You would see a small, scrappy ape trying to survive, trying to avoid the crocodiles in the river, trying to dodge the leopard in the grass, trying to carry some tubers back to its nest before sunset. And yet, that ape was walking. And that changed everything. This is the story of how standing, one of the riskiest bets in the history of life on Earth, became the foundation for minds, for fire, for language, for art, for cities, and for this very moment, where you, a walking ape, are listening to the story of another walking ape who lived 3 million years ago and left behind a skeleton that still whispers, against all odds, that it was worth it. There is an ancient irony carved into every human skeleton, a quiet, relentless reminder that the most defining thing about our species is also one of its greatest liabilities. The simple act of standing upright, walking, balancing on 2 legs. It is a choice written into our bones. A choice that reshaped the very architecture of the body. A choice that redefined how we moved, how we lived, how we raised children, how we survived predators, how we fought, how we built the future. And a choice that has cursed every modern human with back pain, knee injuries, ankle sprains, difficult childbirth, hernias, and the slow collapse of our spine across a long life. It is the most important evolutionary gamble our lineage ever made, and it was made astonishingly early, long before big brains, long before fire, long before language, tools, or even the genus Homo. The fossil record tells us that the commitment to walking upright was locked in by at least 3,700,000 years ago, perhaps as early as 4 million years ago. And by the time Lucy walked the Afar Triangle 3,200,000 years ago, her skeleton had already paid the price. Her body was no longer that of a generalist ape. It was a specialist walker, a creature reshaped by the brutal mathematics of gravity. This transformation was not cosmetic. It rewired the entire relationship between the body and the environment. The change begins, as it must, with the pelvis. In quadrupeds like chimpanzees, the pelvis is long, narrow, and blade-like, perfect for supporting a horizontal torso. But for bipedal walking, the pelvis must rotate and widen. Lucy's pelvis is short and broad, wrapping around the torso like a bowl to hold the internal organs upright against gravity. Her sacrum is expanded and curved. Her ilium flares out to the sides. This widening provides the crucial anchor points for the gluteal muscles, those unsung heroes of walking. In apes, these muscles are minor stabilizers. In bipeds, they become the main system for balance, preventing the body from tipping sideways with every step. Without them, walking would collapse into an endless fall. Then there is the femur. The thigh bone tells its own story. In bipeds, the femur is angled inward toward the midline of the body. This valgus angle brings the knees under the center of gravity, allowing the foot to land directly beneath the torso. Lucy's femur carries this angle clearly. Her knees are knock-kneed by ape standards, but perfectly tuned for walking. Her tibia, the shin bone, locks securely against the femur in an extended position. A straight-legged stance is shockingly rare in the animal kingdom. It means the skeleton, not the muscles, carries the load of standing still. This frees energy but introduces new risks, like torn ligaments, dislocated knees, and joint wear that any modern human can relate to. Move down to the foot, and the story continues. The chimpanzee foot is a grasping hand designed for climbing with an opposable big toe. Lucy's foot is something else. The big toe is aligned forward, parallel with the others. An arch runs from the heel to the ball of the foot, absorbing shock and propelling the body forward. Her heel bone is enlarged, designed to strike the ground first. Fossilized footprints from Laetoli, dating to around 3,600,000 years ago, confirm the reality of this anatomy. Those ancient footprints show a human-like gait, heel strikes, toe-offs, a narrow walking path. But biomechanical models suggest that while Lucy walked upright with confidence, her gait was not identical to ours. Her stride was shorter, her knees remained slightly flexed, her hips swayed more. It was a kind of walking shaped by the compromises of a body still partway between worlds. But walking is not just legs. The entire upper body reshapes to accommodate this shift. The spine curves into a distinctive S shape. This is not aesthetic. It acts as a suspension system, allowing the torso to balance over the pelvis without collapsing forward. The lumbar vertebrae become massive, weight-bearing structures. Lucy's lower spine is not as curved as ours, but the adaptations are there. Her rib cage tapers downward, unlike the barrel-shaped chest of quadrupeds. This narrows the center of mass, pulling it above the hips. Even the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord passes, is repositioned forward, directly beneath the cranium. This is the hallmark of habitual upright posture. The head balances like a ball on a stick, not like a counterweight swinging forward from a horizontal frame. This anatomical cascade reaches even the arms. With walking delegated fully to the legs, the arms are freed from locomotion. But in Lucy's case, the arms remain long, the shoulder blades high and tilted, a relic of her arboreal past. She could still climb, still grasp, still retreat to the trees for food, safety, or sleep. But her hands were no longer hands for walking. The wrist joints in Australopithecus afarensis show a reduced ability for knuckle walking. Her species was fully committed to bipedalism on the ground, even if the trees remained part of the survival toolkit. But here is the evolutionary paradox. Why? Why make this transition when the costs were so high? The fossil record cannot answer perfectly, but the clues suggest a complex web of pressures. Climate models show that between 4 million and 3 million years ago, East Africa underwent cycles of drying. Dense forests thinned into patchy woodlands and grasslands. For an ape used to moving through the canopy, this fragmentation forced a choice: either become more efficient on the ground or risk extinction. Bipedalism is energy efficient over long distances. It frees the hands for carrying food, infants, or tools. It elevates the head for scanning predators across the savanna. It reduces the surface area exposed to the blistering midday sun. All of these advantages mattered. None were sufficient alone. Together, they tipped the balance. But walking came with permanent trade-offs. Narrowed pelvises for upright balance made childbirth vastly more difficult. The human obstetric dilemma is born here. The need to pass a large-brained infant through a constrained birth canal would become a defining pressure on later Homo evolution. Back pain begins here too. Our spines, evolved from a horizontal frame, were never fully designed for the vertical loads of standing. Herniated discs, sciatica, and compressed nerves are the price of a head held high. And yet, walking changed everything. It was the hinge, the inflection point. Once the lineage committed to bipedalism, it set off a chain of consequences that would echo through every descendant species. Free hands allowed for more sophisticated tool use selected for more complex cognition. Cognition drove language, cooperation, and eventually culture. The brain did not drive walking. Walking drove the brain. Lucy's skeleton marks that turning point. When we look at her bones today, laid out in museum cases or rendered in virtual scans, they whisper this truth. The body you inhabit, its strengths, its flaws, its impossible balancing act, is the long shadow of this decision. A decision made not by a single ancestor, but by the relentless sieve of natural selection acting over hundreds of thousands of years. A decision made not in a moment, but in a million quiet adaptations to the friction between anatomy and environment. 3,200,000 years ago, in the dust of the Afar Triangle, a small female hominin carried this legacy in every step. She did not know she was reshaping the destiny of a species. She was simply walking, looking for food, avoiding predators, maybe carrying an infant, maybe moving toward water. And then one day, she stopped walking. Her bones settled into the earth, and by some miracle of geology, luck, and time, she was preserved, waiting to remind us that every step we take today is a ripple from her world. This is the anatomy of a turning point, the most important mistake in human evolution, and the reason we are here. It is one of the most persistent questions ever asked about Lucy, one that still echoes in labs, in field camps, and in the quiet corners of museums where her bones rest behind glass. Did she still climb? Or had she already abandoned the trees for good? This is not a trivial question. It is not just about Lucy. It is about us, about what we are, about when we stopped being just apes walking among the branches, and started being something else entirely. To answer it, we first have to step back. 3,700,000 years ago, the world that Australopithecus afarensis inherited was not the open grassland paradise once imagined in old textbooks. It was not an endless savanna calling these creatures down from the trees in some grand linear march toward humanity. Instead, East Africa was a mosaic, a patchwork of dense woodlands, open grasslands, river corridors, and forested edges. Not quite jungle, not quite plain, but both, and neither. Fossil pollen and isotope data from this era paint a complex picture. Grasses were certainly present, so were shrubs, but so were trees, plenty of them. Seasonal lakes came and went, floodplains expanded and shrank. The environment shifted constantly in rhythm with the planet's eccentric orbit and climatic pulses. To live here was to adapt, not to a single habitat, but to constant change. And that raises a very real question about Lucy's body. Was it adapted for walking, or for climbing, or both? Her lower half screams terrestrial, the angle of her femur drawing the knee inward under the body, a broad, bowl-shaped pelvis balancing her upright posture, a spinal curve engineered to keep the center of mass over the hips, her knees locked fully straight, her feet, particularly the big toe, aligned for push-off, not for grasping. This is the textbook anatomy of a biped. Not perfect, not modern, but committed. And yet, the upper half of her body tells a more ambiguous story. Long, curved fingers, strong, muscular forearms, shoulder joints that point upward, not sideways like ours, a shoulder blade that looks startlingly like that of a young gorilla. Her wrist bones are robust, capable of bearing weight in flexed positions. All of these are the signature of a body still fluent in the grammar of trees. A body that, while walking confidently on the ground, still understood the branches. For decades, paleoanthropologists have wrestled with this paradox. Was Lucy a transitional form, halfway between the canopy and the savanna? Or were these arboreal features just evolutionary leftovers, biological scaffolding that had not yet been pruned by natural selection? Some argue that evolutionary inertia is slow. The upper limbs simply had not caught up with the lower. After all, skeletons do not remodel overnight. It is entirely possible that the climbing features in Lucy's shoulders and arms were vestigial, no longer used, but not yet gone. Others disagree. They point to the biomechanics of her joints. Her shoulder is not just gorilla-shaped. It works like a gorilla's. Her hands are not just long-fingered. They are mechanically optimized for gripping curved surfaces, branches, not tools. The stress patterns on fossil wrist bones from other afarensis specimens suggest regular loading in flexed positions, which does not happen from walking on flat ground. It happens from climbing. But climb for what? And climb when? Here, the debate widens into ecology. In a landscape full of predators, saber-toothed cats, crocodiles, giant eagles, retreating into the trees was more than nostalgia. It was survival. Sleeping in trees, as chimpanzees do today, may have been essential. Feeding on fruits, or perhaps escaping midday heat in the canopy, might have tilted the balance between life and death. Then again, the larger males in the species were likely less arboreal. Their heavier bodies, their broader chests, suggest a preference for the ground. Fossil footprints, including the famous Laetoli trackways, show hominins walking with human-like stride mechanics over long distances. No knuckle prints, no sideways toe splay, no hint of quadrupedal movement. But the Laetoli tracks capture only a moment, one day in the wet ash of a volcanic eruption. They do not tell us what happened when night fell, or when danger came, or when the dry season pushed fruit-bearing trees into scarcity. Enter Salam, the fossilized skeleton of a young afarensis child, discovered in 2006, preserved with extraordinary detail including the shoulder blades, a part missing from Lucy. Salam's scapula is near identical to that of a juvenile gorilla, not just similar in shape but in mechanical function. This was not a fluke. This was a climbing shoulder. Yet even here, uncertainty reigns. Is this an indicator of species-wide behavior, or is it a developmental artifact? After all, young chimpanzees spend far more time in trees than adults. Juvenile gorillas climb with ease, while the silverbacks largely remain earthbound. Was Salam's anatomy reflective of childhood ecology or of lifelong habits? The truth, humbling as it is, may be both. Australopithecus afarensis seems to have occupied a unique ecological niche, a biped that walked routinely and efficiently, but one that had not entirely severed its ties to the arboreal world, a creature of both the ground and the canopy. Its anatomy reflects not confusion, but versatility, a body built for compromise in a world that demanded it. This duality raises deeper questions. Why did bipedalism evolve at all, if the trees were still there? Energy efficiency offers part of the answer. Walking on two legs uses less energy over long distances than quadrupedal knuckle walking, a valuable adaptation in a landscape where resources were patchy, where travel between food patches mattered. But energy alone does not explain the persistence of climbing features, nor does it fully explain why upright walking began millions of years before brain expansion, tool use, or complex social behaviors. This was not a package deal. Upright walking arrived first, long before Homo, long before fire, long before anyone could tell a story like this one. There is a humility in this realization. The road to humanity was not a straight line. It was not a ladder. It was a branching bush, a tangled experiment. And Lucy, neither fully ape nor fully human, was one of its most successful experiments for nearly 1,000,000 years. So did she climb? Almost certainly yes, but not like an ape that lives in trees, more like a human that remembers them. She walked when she could. She climbed when she must. She belonged to both worlds. And perhaps, in some quiet way, that is exactly what made her ours. This is what we know, so far. And yet, even now, the soil of East Africa is still hiding more clues, more skeletons, more forgotten lives. The branches of our story are still growing. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of silt, volcanic ash, and time, another fossil waits, another chance to rewrite the story. Or perhaps, just to remind us how little of it we truly understand. There is something quietly haunting about the fractures of an ancient skeleton. When a bone breaks in deep time, it holds two stories. The story of how it was used in life, and the story of how it was broken, either by living forces or by the chaotic accidents of time. And no fossil in human history has been studied, argued over, and emotionally projected upon more than this one. Lucy, a 3,200,000-year-old skeleton pulled from the sediments of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 Triangle, a creature who was neither ape nor human, a bridge between worlds, and perhaps a body broken by falling between them. But what actually happened? Did a tree kill the world's most famous fossil? Or are the broken patterns in her bones just the randomness of fossilization, trampled by scavengers, crushed by shifting sediments, or cracked by the chemistry of preservation? This is one of the strangest and most emotionally charged mysteries in the study of human origins. Because when you look closely at Lucy's fossilized bones, one thing becomes inescapably clear. There are fractures everywhere. Hairline cracks, compressive fractures, spiral breaks in the long bones, collapsed parts of the pelvis, crushed ribs, and most tellingly, a fracture on the upper right arm. The kind of break that happens when a living creature stretches out a hand to brace for impact and fails. The theory did not come quickly. For 40 years after her discovery, most scientists assumed that Lucy's broken state was just the normal violence of fossilization. Bodies rarely survive intact in the 𝐓𝐈𝐿 sediments. Carnivores drag bones. Rain and wind scatter them. Layers of sediment compress them. Chemical processes erode or warp the edges. If anything, the miracle was that so much of her was preserved at all. 40% of a full skeleton is almost unheard of in paleoanthropology. But in the year 2016, something strange happened. A pair of researchers at the University of Texas, John Kappelman and his team, decided to run a full-body, high-resolution CT scan of Lucy's skeleton. This was not just a routine imaging exercise. This was the first time Lucy's entire skeleton had been scanned in detail down to the microscopic structure of her bones. What the scan revealed was unsettling. Many of the fractures were not random. They showed characteristic patterns of what in modern forensic anthropology are called perimortem fractures, breaks that occur at or near the time of death, when bones still retain the elasticity of living tissue. The most damning evidence was the pattern of the shoulder. The upper arm bone, the humerus, showed a compressive axial fracture, exactly the kind that forms when a body braces for a fall. In modern accident victims, it is a common pattern seen when someone falls from a significant height, lands feet first or hip first, and then instinctively stretches out their arms to try to stop the fall, only for the forces to travel back up the arm, shattering the shoulder joint. Lucy's skeleton also shows a crushed pelvis and compressed lower vertebrae, suggesting a feet-first impact. Her ankle bones display subtle microfractures consistent with a rapid deceleration. In total, the scan revealed more than 20 fractures that could plausibly have happened while the body was still fleshy, not dried, brittle, or buried. The conclusion was bold. Kappelman's team proposed that Lucy died from falling out of a tree, possibly 20 or more meters high, a fatal plunge from a sleeping platform, a foraging branch, or a desperate escape from predators. Her bones, they argued, still carried the signature of a fall between worlds, the ancient tension between tree life and ground life that defined her species. But not everyone agreed. Within months, a storm of criticism swept through the paleoanthropology community. Several prominent researchers, including Donald Johanson himself, the man who discovered Lucy, pushed back hard. Their argument was simple. Fossilization is violent. bones warp, crack, and crush under geological forces we barely understand. The fractures could easily have occurred after burial. Some might have come from the collapse of sediment layers, others from pressure over hundreds of thousands of years, others still from being walked on by passing animals. A body does not need to fall from a tree to end up broken. This debate cuts deep, because underneath it is a bigger question about who Lucy really was, and how she lived. Did Australopithecus afarensis still live partly in the trees, as her shoulder blade morphology and curved fingers suggest? Or by Lucy's time, around 3,200,000 years ago, had her species fully committed to the ground, becoming terrestrial bipeds in a world that was slowly drying, opening into grasslands? The evidence is maddeningly ambiguous. On one hand, the shape of her pelvis, femur, and foot is utterly committed to walking upright. She was no longer an ape when it came to moving across the ground. Her knee locked straight, her femur angled inward to support a balanced gait. Her feet had arches, her big toe pointed forward, not grasping like a chimpanzee's. But from the waist up, Lucy still whispers of an arboreal past. Her shoulder joint was oriented more like a climber than a walker. Her fingers were long and curved, efficient for gripping branches. Her ribcage flared outward in a cone shape, like modern apes, allowing for a gut that processed fibrous plant material, perhaps more suited to a forager who still retreated to trees for food or safety. If Lucy did fall from a tree, it would suggest that her species was still regularly using the canopy, perhaps building sleeping platforms as chimpanzees do today, or climbing to escape leopards, crocodiles, and the ever-present risk of predatory eagles. But it would also be the story of an evolutionary gamble starting to strain, a body optimized for walking, but still asked, sometimes, to climb. Yet the forensic case remains uncertain. Bone fractures are not fossils of behavior. They are riddles of physics. Every break has multiple possible explanations, and the fossil record has no witness testimony. For every fracture pattern that suggests a fall, there is another that looks just like the crushing weight of sediment over 1,000,000 years. Kappelman's team argued that the pattern and sharpness of Lucy's fractures do not match what we typically see in post-mortem sediment compression. In particular, the shoulder fracture is not a clean snap, but a compression failure. The bones did not splinter as dry bones do, but crushed as wet bones do under load. But skeptics point out that sedimentary pressure can be highly variable, and bones sometimes fracture in surprising ways when trapped in complex burial matrices. A further layer of mystery is added when we consider the rest of the Hadar site. Lucy was not the only Australopithecus afarensis fossil found here. Nearby, the so-called first family, 13 individuals of all ages, was uncovered in a single stratigraphic layer, suggesting a catastrophic event. Some researchers have speculated about flash floods, sudden collapses, or mass deaths from other causes. Could Lucy have been part of a similar event? Drowned, swept, and crushed, not fallen? Or perhaps we are asking the wrong question. Perhaps the mistake is imagining that there must be a singular cause. The boundary between life and death, between burial and fossilization, between random breakage and meaningful evidence, is never clean. It is messy. It is probabilistic. It is a dice roll through deep time. In the end, the fall theory remains plausible, but unproven. Like so much in paleoanthropology, it stands as a beautiful hypothesis forever balanced on the knife edge of incomplete evidence. And maybe that is fitting, because Lucy herself was balanced between two evolutionary worlds, between trees and ground, between past and future, between ape and human. Her fractured bones are not just a forensic puzzle. They are an echo of the deeper fragility of memory in deep time. Of all the countless lives that came before us, Lucy's is one of the infinitesimally rare to be remembered at all. And even now, we cannot fully agree on what her memory means. Whether her death was an accident of climbing, a hazard of walking, or a final argument in the grand evolutionary debate between ground and sky. What we do know is that she mattered, not because her species was perfect or destined, but because it was in the midst of the great experiment that would, millions of years later, lead to us. Upright, curious, fragile, and still falling, in our own way, through the uncertain future of the species we call Homo sapiens. This is where her story, at least for now, pauses in the sediment. But it does not end. because every question about Lucy is a mirror of a question about ourselves. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. It is a strange thing, isn't it, to think that the story of an entire species, perhaps even the story of us, might hinge on something as mundane as what could be chewed, cracked, sucked, or dug out of the dirt. When we imagine the great forces of evolution, we often think of epic battles against predators, heroic migrations, or cataclysmic changes in climate. And yet, at the center of it all, always, is food. What you can eat, what you can't, what eats you while you are looking for it. And so it was for Australopithecus afarensis, for Lucy. Somewhere between 3.7 and 3.0 million years ago, her world was a dry, patchy mosaic of open grasslands, scattered shrubs, and thinning forests. A landscape teetering on the edge between the old world of the forest canopy and the open savanna that would eventually become the engine room of human evolution. It was a world full of danger, but also full of calories, if you knew where to look. So what exactly did a small-bodied, small-brained, upright ape eat to survive here? This question has puzzled paleoanthropologists for decades, not just because it tells us about Lucy, but because it tells us something deeper about what happens when a species begins to step away from the forest, when hands are freed from locomotion, and the mouth becomes the ultimate evolutionary interface between body and world. The first clue lies in the teeth. When we examine the fossilized molars of Australopithecus afarensis, they are large, very large. Broad, flat surfaces, thick enamel, robust jaws designed for serious mechanical processing. This is not the mouth of a meat specialist like a lion, nor the delicate frugivore design of a modern chimpanzee. This is a grinder, a machine built for pulverizing tough, fibrous materials. But teeth alone only hint at the menu. For deeper answers, we turn to a technique called stable isotope analysis. When an animal eats, the chemical signature of its food becomes locked into the hard tissues of its teeth, particularly in the enamel. And when scientists study the carbon isotopes within Lucy's teeth, an astonishing pattern emerges. Her carbon signature indicates a heavy reliance on what scientists call C4 plants. These are plants adapted to arid, open environments, grasses, sedges, and certain drought-resistant herbs. Plants that most modern apes ignore almost entirely. This was not a diet made up primarily of sweet forest fruits. Instead, it was a menu from the open world. Grasses, tubers, underground storage organs, roots, things that require strength to dig up, patience to process, and powerful teeth to chew. And yet, a grass-based diet alone could never be enough. There is no species on Earth, not even the most dedicated grazing animals, that survives on cellulose alone without a highly specialized digestive system. And Australopithecus afarensis had no such adaptation, which means there had to be something else, something more calorie-rich, something worth the risk of leaving the trees behind. Here, the evidence gets even more interesting. Fossilized animal bones found at Dinkinesh, dated to about 3.4 million years ago, the same time as Lucy's species, bear marks that look suspiciously like stone tool cut marks, slicing marks, percussion marks where bones were fractured open, likely to access the marrow inside, the kind of marks that, in any later context, would be immediately recognized as evidence of meat processing. Now, this evidence is controversial. Some argue that the marks could have been made by trampling, by rocks moving in a floodplain, or by other natural processes. Others maintain that the pattern, the angles, and the depth of the marks are entirely consistent with butchery. But if it holds, if these marks are what they appear to be, it means that Lucy's kind were not just eating plants, they were scavenging, perhaps even opportunistically hunting small prey. And if they were cracking bones for marrow, they were tapping into one of the richest energy sources available in the ancient world. Bone marrow is pure fat, clean, stable calories, a survival jackpot for a hungry primate walking under the Pliocene sun. This brings us to an even deeper question. If Lucy's species was eating meat, whether through scavenging or opportunistic hunting, how did they access it? There is no direct evidence of spears, traps, or coordinated hunts at this stage, but stone tools? That's a fuzzier line. For decades, scientists believed that the first deliberately shaped stone tools, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 industry, appeared around 2.6 million years ago, long after Lucy's time. But then came a shock. In 2015, at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 in Kenya, researchers uncovered a collection of stone tools dated to 3.3 million years ago. Hammers, cores, sharp flakes, a full 700,000 years older than the 𝐓𝐈𝐿, tools that existed right within the time window of Australopithecus afarensis. Now, whether Lucy's species actually made these tools remains uncertain. Some suggest they were crafted by a different hominin, perhaps Kenyanthropus platyops, whose fossils have been found nearby. Others argue that Australopithecus was entirely capable of the motor control and cognitive sequencing needed to produce simple flaked tools. After all, chimpanzees today use sticks to fish termites, stones to crack nuts, and leaves to collect water. Why not a sharpened flake to open a bone? And then there's the fallback food hypothesis. When times were good, wet seasons, fruiting cycles, plentiful vegetation, Lucy's diet was probably broad and flexible. But in the lean seasons, when the rains failed and the grasses dried out, fallback foods became critical. Hard seeds, woody stems, underground tubers, food that isn't delicious but won't let you die. And this, more than anything, may be what Lucy's teeth are really telling us. Her species wasn't specialized for one perfect meal. They were generalists, survivors, masters of scraping a living from the margins. Of course, for every calorie gained, there was a cost. While Lucy was searching for food, whether digging, foraging, or cautiously approaching a carcass, she was also being watched. The fossil record makes it brutally clear just how dangerous this world was. Skull fragments from Australopithecus specimens bear puncture wounds consistent with leopard fangs. Crocodile bite marks pepper the bones of others, their arcs of teeth perfectly matching modern Nile crocodiles. And the most haunting perhaps of all, the Tong child, a tiny Australopithecus africanus from southern Africa, whose skull contains damage most consistent with the talons of a large bird of prey, probably an eagle, lifted from the ground, carried into the sky. A reminder that in the Pliocene, the threat did not always come from the ground. Lucy's species lived small. They traveled in groups, likely for protection, for shared knowledge, and for collective vigilance. They probably spent the night in trees, constructing nests like modern chimpanzees, where the cool air kept the bugs at bay and the height kept the leopards just a little farther away. By day, they ventured out, navigating a thin line between finding food and not becoming it. And here is where we must be humble. Much of this story is built from fragments, bits of jawbone, a trail of footprints, isotopes locked in enamel. Nature preserves almost nothing. The fact that we can even sketch this picture at all is a minor miracle of geology and luck. How much we are missing, we will never truly know. But what is clear is that Lucy's life was a daily gamble. Every step onto the open ground was a calculation. Is there food out there? Is it worth the risk? Is that shape on the horizon a carcass or a lion? In this gamble, one innovation made all the difference. Bipedalism, walking upright. It freed the hands. It allowed Lucy to carry what she found, whether it was a tuber, a strip of meat, or an infant. It let her travel farther in search of scattered resources. It reduced her exposure to the equatorial sun by presenting a smaller profile. And yet, it also slowed her down. She was no longer as fast in the trees as her fully arboreal cousins. On the ground, she could neither outrun predators nor overpower them. Her best defense was to see them coming, and to not be alone. And so, standing on the savanna floor of what is now Ethiopia, somewhere between 3.7 and 3.0 million years ago, a small primate made a bet. She bet on walking, on flexibility, on the ability to survive not because she was the strongest or the fastest, but because she could adapt, and though she could never know it, it was a bet that would ultimately change the world. Because in the end, the story of Lucy's diet is the story of survival itself, the story of what it takes to persist when the easy food is gone, when the forest recedes, and when every bite must be fought for. It is the story of an ape who learned that the ground, dangerous though it was, could also be generous, and that sometimes the greatest evolutionary leap is simply walking far enough to find what others cannot. This is what we know. For now. If you follow the trail of scattered bones long enough, you inevitably arrive at a question that paleoanthropology has been circling for decades. When did the first apes stop merely eating with their hands and start reshaping the world around them? When did survival cross the invisible line between bare fingers and sharpened stone? The fossils and the dirt do not answer that cleanly, but they leave us clues. Clues scattered between 3,400,000 and 3,200,000 years ago. And some of those clues point directly at Lucy. If you step back, there is something strangely fitting about this period. For millions of years, our ancestors were trapped in a kind of evolutionary holding pattern. Upright but not yet free, adapted to both trees and ground but fully mastered neither. With brains barely bigger than a chimpanzee's, Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, wasn't supposed to be an inventor. At least, not according to what scientists thought even half a century ago. Tool use, we believed, was the domain of something later, something smarter, something called Homo. Then the bones said otherwise. In 2015, a team working at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 in Kenya uncovered something that broke the timeline wide open. Heavy chunks of volcanic stone, bashed and flaked into sharp-edged tools, not casually broken rocks, not the incidental damage of hooves or erosion, but clear, deliberate shaping. These were cores and flakes, the essential ingredients of a cutting toolkit. And the date? Roughly 3,300,000 years old, 500,000 years older than the genus Homo, long before anyone shaped anything that could be called a hand axe or a spear point. These were not sleek, elegant tools. They were crude, bulky, awkward. But they were tools. And by every measure we can apply, they were deliberately made by something. Something with the coordination, the grip strength, and the mental modeling to strike one stone against another and turn fracture into survival. Here is the strange part. The 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 tools were found near fossils of Kenyanthropus platyops, an enigmatic hominin species that is still barely understood. Some scientists suspect it might be a separate branch of the family tree. Others wonder whether it even deserves its own species label. But no matter how you slice it, Australopithecus afarensis was also living in the same region at the same time. The footprints are there, the bones are there, and this leaves a wide, ambiguous window where both species might have been wielding stone. So could Lucy, her family, her kind, have been a tool maker? Not just a tool user like chimpanzees cracking nuts with rocks or poking termites with sticks, but something more, something deliberate, something systematic. The dirt at Dinkinesh, Ethiopia, may hold part of the answer. In 2010, archaeologists uncovered fossilized animal bones there with marks on them, very peculiar marks, tiny parallel grooves etched into rib bones, deep, V-shaped cuts scored across joints, and on one femur, what looks like the telltale crush mark from a hammerstone smashing down to split it open. The bones were dated to roughly 3,400,000 years ago, the same window as the 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 tools, and critically, the only hominin species known to be living in Dinkinesh at that time was Australopithecus afarensis. That alone was enough to send tremors through the scientific community. If the marks are truly cut marks, and that is still debated, then they would represent the oldest evidence of butchery ever found, not by Homo habilis, not by Homo erectus, but by upright apes like Lucy, apes with chimp-sized brains but apparently a growing appetite for meat, and for ingenuity. But here is where humility must lead the story. Not everyone agrees on what those marks mean. Some researchers argue they could have been made by trampling, sharp rocks pressed against bone underfoot by passing animals. Others point out that natural processes like river tumbling can sometimes mimic cut marks. The debate is not settled. Perhaps it never fully will be. And yet, the evidence stacks, piece by piece. The hands of Australopithecus afarensis were surprisingly human-like in some critical ways. The thumb was strong, the fingers curved, yes, an echo of arboreal life, but the joints and proportions suggest a precision grip was already in place. Not the full dexterity of a modern human carpenter, but enough to hold, manipulate, and repeatedly strike two stones together with intent. If they were using tools, even occasionally, the question then becomes, what for? Meat is the obvious answer. But the savanna offered more than flesh. Digging sticks could pry up calorie-rich tubers hidden beneath dry soil. Simple pounding stones could crack open nuts or smash seeds into digestible pulp. And then there is marrow, that fatty, nutrient-rich prize locked inside long bones. Bones that the jaws of lions or hyenas could not always break, but a hammerstone could. There is a reason anthropologists refer to marrow as the original superfood of the Pleistocene. A single femur from a wildebeest contains thousands of calories packed in fat. For a small hominin with a fragile body and a high metabolism, it could be the difference between surviving a dry season or not. But let's be clear, if Lucy and her kind were using tools, they were still scavengers, not hunters of large game. No Australopithecus was taking down antelopes or zebras, not with their size, not with their teeth, not with their arms. Instead, they were part of a long competitive chain of opportunists, finding carcasses, timing the approach perfectly between the lions leaving and the hyenas arriving, or perhaps muscling smaller predators off a kill, a behavior we still see in modern baboons, who can be shockingly aggressive when food is at stake. This behavior would not have looked anything like a modern hunting party. It would have looked like a mob, a cluster of bipedal apes descending on a half-eaten carcass, smashing bone, scraping sinew, eyes scanning the grass for what else might be watching them. And here is where it gets eerie. Studies of stable isotopes in the teeth of Australopithecus afarensis suggest a significant portion of their diet came from C4 plants, grasses, sedges, and the animals that ate them. This is a distinct shift from the diets of chimpanzees and gorillas, who rely heavily on forest fruits. Something about Australopithecus was already leaning toward open landscapes, toward the grasslands, toward the dangerous, calorie-rich chaos of the savanna. Whether it was meat, marrow, or mechanical advantage over hard-to-digest plant foods, the consequences were the same. The hands adapted, the teeth adapted, and perhaps the mind began its long, slow transformation. But we must not project too much. There is a danger in assuming that every scratch on a bone and every flake of rock marks the beginning of something inevitable. Evolution is not a ladder. It is not progress. It is only survival, one generation at a time. If Australopithecus afarensis was flirting with technology, it may have been episodic, seasonal, learned and forgotten, picked up by some bands, abandoned by others. This may be the true birth of culture, not the high art of cave paintings or the sophistication of language, but something far messier. Knowledge passed not genetically but socially, a mother showing her child which rock to use, a juvenile copying a clever ant, a trick, a gesture, a moment that became memory. And it is here, in this liminal space, that Lucy's species stands, neither fully ape nor fully human, not yet the makers of fire, or shelters, or spears, but perhaps makers of something, of edges, of leverage, of the first tiny, brittle foothold on the long path toward controlling the world. No matter where the debate on the Dinkinesh bones or the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀 tools ultimately lands, one thing is certain. By 3 million years ago, the cognitive landscape of our ancestors was shifting, slowly, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. Somewhere between the teeth, the tools, and the marrow lies the hinge point of everything that followed. Lucy may not have known she was holding the first key, but 3 million years later, we are still trying to figure out whether she was. It is a strange thing, really, to try to untangle your own origin. In most sciences, the object of study is comfortably distant. Galaxies will never ask why you studied them. Rocks will not take offense when you get their history wrong. But paleoanthropology is different. The fossils we unearth are not just ancient bones. They are us, or at least some version of us. And when we try to fit those bones into a family tree, we are really trying to draw a map of our own existence. A map whose lines are blurry, whose branches twist, collapse, merge, and split in ways that still confound the people who spend entire lifetimes trying to read them. When Lucy was first lifted from the dirt in 1974, the story seemed, for a brief moment, almost tidy. Here was an ancient upright walker, small-brained but clearly bipedal, living over 3 million years ago, a creature halfway between ape and human, straddling the line between two worlds. It was tempting, so tempting, to look at that skeleton and declare her the mother of humanity, to point and say, "There, That is where the line begins. For many years, the field leaned into that story. Lucy and her species Australopithecus afarensis seemed to sit perfectly at the root of the human lineage, the bridge from ape-like ancestors to the tool-making, brain-growing species that would become Homo. But science is not a place where stories get to stay simple, not for long, because the more the Earth gave up its secrets, the messier the tree became. First came the revelation that Lucy was not the first upright walker. In 1994, a fossil in Kenya was dated to about 4,100,000 years ago. Australopithecus anamensis, an even older relative. It shared many traits with afarensis, but with a jaw and teeth closer to more primitive apes. Then, a few years later, the Earth surrendered something even stranger. In the Ethiopian desert of Middle Awash, paleontologists unearthed a partial skeleton dating back 4,400,000 years. They called it Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardi was a problem, a beautiful, confusing problem. Her skeleton showed an upright posture unlike anything seen before, her pelvis restructured in a way that supported bipedal walking. But her feet still bore a grasping big toe, more suited for climbing trees than walking the savanna. Ardi was not an Australopithecine, she was something more primitive, and yet already bipedal. This pushed the timeline of walking upright back another 500,000 years. And it raised an unsettling question. If bipedalism started with Ardi, or even earlier, then where did that leave Lucy? The branches of the family tree started to split further. In Kenya, fossils of a flat-faced hominin appeared, Kenyanthropus platyops. At around 3,500,000 years old, it overlapped with Lucy's species. But it looked different. Was it a cousin? A rival lineage? Or an evolutionary dead end? Then there were the robust Australopithecines, Paranthropus, big-toothed, small-brained, and clearly adapted to a different ecological gamble, heavy chewing, massive jaws, and a diet built around roots, tubers, and hard plant matter. They too split off from something, perhaps from Lucy's kind, or perhaps from an even older ancestor. And all the while, the ghost of the Homo genus loomed. Somewhere, sometime, between 2,800,000 and 2,500,000 years ago, the first members of our own genus emerged. Homo habilis, the so-called handyman, was long thought to be the earliest. But new discoveries suggest something even earlier. Fossils from Ledijararu in Ethiopia, dated to around 2,800,000 years ago, bear the hallmarks of Homo. Flatter faces, smaller teeth, and jaws reshaped for a different diet, a different future. Here is the brutal reality of paleoanthropology. For every fossil we find, there are tens of thousands that disintegrated into dust long before anyone could ever see them. The entire continent of Africa 3 million years ago was full of living, breathing primates. Upright walkers, tree climbers, tool users, opportunists, and experiments. Some of those experiments led nowhere. Some, perhaps, led to us. But the fossil record is not a book. It is a shredded postcard, written in a language we barely understand, with half the words smudged by time. So, was Lucy our mother, or just our cousin? The honest answer is that we do not know. And if we are honest with ourselves, we may never know with certainty. Evolution is not a ladder. It is not a straight line from primitive to advanced, from ape to human. It is a braided stream, a tangled web of populations, diverging and merging, spreading and contracting, leaving traces in some places and vanishing without a whisper in others. What we can say, with some confidence, is this. Australopithecus afarensis was one of the most successful hominin species to ever exist. It thrived for nearly 1 million years, spread across vast stretches of East Africa, and adapted to a challenging landscape filled with predators, droughts, and shifting ecosystems. Its members walked upright, freeing their hands for tasks that would become the foundation of everything that followed. Its anatomy, part arboreal, part terrestrial, embodied the gamble of a species caught between the safety of the trees and the opportunity of the open ground. It is possible, even likely, that Lucy's lineage contributed genetically to the emergence of Homo. But whether she was the direct mother or simply part of a broader pool of upright apes whose genes blended into the stream that became us, that remains a question marked by uncertainty. This is not a failure of science. This is what science looks like when it is honest. a willingness to sit with the unknown, to accept that some parts of our story may remain shadows, and to understand that even those shadows are part of the truth. What matters, perhaps, is not whether Lucy was our direct ancestor. What matters is what she represents. A fossil waiting 3 million years to remind us that the line between ape and human was never clean, never obvious, and that the journey from walking upright to thinking, dreaming, and asking these questions was not a line at all. It was a mosaic, a series of experiments written into the bones of creatures who could not possibly have known that one day, millions of years later, their skeletons would be lifted from the dirt and whispered about in the quiet spaces of late-night minds trying to remember where we came from. If Lucy taught us anything, it is that no fossil tells the whole story. She was a clue, a remarkably complete one. But even as her skeleton stared back at us from across 3 million years of time, it became obvious to science that Lucy was not alone, neither in life nor in her species. The moment her bones emerged from the sediment of Hadar, they were followed by others. Bigger bones, smaller bones, older, younger, more complete, more mysterious. Fossils that complicated the story rather than simplified it. And together, they began to whisper something humbling about the process of evolution itself, something we tend to forget when we imagine the so-called ladder of progress, that evolution is never linear. It sprawls sideways. It branches, collapses, retrees, and experiments in parallel. It is not a march. It is a scatter. The first crack in the illusion of Lucy as the single face of Australopithecus afarensis came just a year after her discovery. In 1975, barely 12 months after the team celebrated the find that would make headlines around the world, they struck a new deposit in the same region of Hadar. This time, it wasn't one skeleton. It was 13, adults, juveniles, children. A tragedy preserved in stone. A mass death event, though to this day nobody knows exactly what caused it. Maybe a flood, maybe a sudden collapse of sediment, maybe, quite simply, a bad day in the deep Pliocene. The team named this site the First Family. It would become one of the most important fossil assemblages ever recovered from early human evolution. And the message those bones sent was immediate. Australopithecus afarensis was not a single template. It was a spectrum. Some individuals were small, barely taller than Lucy herself, around 1 meter high. Others towered above her, up to 1.70 meters, and weighing more than 60 kilograms. This wasn't just the difference between juveniles and adults. It was sexual dimorphism, the biological pattern where males and females differ significantly in size and sometimes appearance, like we see in modern gorillas or orangutans. A sign that their social dynamics may have been very different from ours. But even that was only the beginning. Over the following decades, fossils began to appear that stretched the boundaries of what afarensis was supposed to be. In 2010, a team working in the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 region of Ethiopia unearthed a skeleton so large, so robust, that it earned the nickname Kadanumu, meaning big man in the local Afar language. Kadanumu lived around 3,600,000 years ago, older than Lucy by nearly 500,000 years. Standing roughly 1.60 meters, he was over 30% larger than Lucy. His leg bones were especially telling. Long, straight, unmistakably adapted for bipedal walking. His shoulder and ribcage, however, retained the same strange mix of human-like and ape-like traits seen in Lucy herself. Kadanumu was not just an oversized Lucy. His proportions forced paleoanthropologists to reconsider the biomechanics of early bipedalism. Was he part of a normal size range within afarensis? Or was he something else? A sister species that happened to overlap in time and place? That question remains open. His skeleton lacked cranial or dental material, the key parts typically used to formally assign species. Without a jawbone to compare to the type specimen from Laetoli, the official fossil that defines Australopithecus afarensis, we simply cannot say with full confidence whether Kadanumu was afarensis or something very close to it. And then, there is the opposite story. Not bigger, but smaller. Not stronger, but more fragile. In the year 2006, a discovery emerged from the site of Dinkinesh, just south of Lucy's resting place. It was a tiny skull, fragile, delicate. The remains of a child no older than 3. The excavation would take 5 years. The fossil encased in rock so hard that removing it became an archaeological feat in itself. This child was named Salam, meaning peace in Amharic. Some called her Lucy's baby, though she lived roughly 100,000 years earlier than Lucy herself. Salam's bones revealed something no adult skeleton could: a glimpse into development, into how a young afarensis grew, moved, and learned to navigate its dangerous world. Her hyoid bone, the small, U-shaped bone in the throat crucial for speech in modern humans, was recovered, showing that while she likely lacked the vocal range of Homo sapiens, she may have had a more complex vocal system than chimpanzees. Her shoulder blades, nearly perfectly preserved, were deeply ape-like. They resembled those of a juvenile gorilla, suggesting that, at least in early life, tree climbing was not just a fallback, it was still a key part of daily survival. Her foot bones were mixed in their signals: a toe for gripping, an ankle built for walking. Together, 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 and Salam bracket Lucy on both ends: male and female, adult and child, large and small. A family, if not by blood, then certainly by evolutionary proximity. But these are only the faces we have found. The fossil record whispers of others, fragments that suggest populations of afarensis may have ranged farther and diversified more than we once imagined. Fossils from Laetoli in Tanzania to the north and east of Ethiopia suggest regional variants. Some slightly older, some slightly younger, some perhaps moving toward different ecological strategies depending on their habitat. And beyond afarensis, the tree keeps fracturing backward in time. To Australopithecus anamensis, discovered from sediments dated around 4 million years ago, the oldest undisputed member of the Australopithecus genus, and further still to Ardipithecus ramidus, at 4,500,000 years ago, a hominin so strange in its anatomy that it looked, in the words of some researchers, like a failed experiment halfway between upright walker and forest climber. So here, the family tree does not look like a ladder, nor a clean diagram with one trunk and tidy branches. It looks like a thicket, a braided stream, species emerging, splitting, hybridizing, or going extinct, sometimes within the same landscape, sometimes within the same millennium. And this is not merely a curiosity of ancient history. This is the real shape of evolution, not just for hominins, for everything, for elephants, for songbirds, for whales, for apes. Lucy, 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, and Salam are reminders of a humbling truth: that every organism alive today represents a lineage that survived, but not necessarily the only lineage that tried. For every species that became a success, dozens vanished. For every fossil we recover, thousands are forever lost to wind, erosion, and the grind of geological time. If there is one lesson that these faces of humanity offer us, it is that being human, or nearly human, was never a destiny. It was a gamble, a lottery of adaptation played out on a dangerous, shifting landscape. There were many ways to be an upright ape. Lucy's way was just one, 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐻𝐒's was another, Salam's was yet a third. And in the end, even they vanished, their footprints erased, their species gone, but not before laying down the patterns, the anatomical experiments, the biological stepping stones, that would eventually lead, through a chain of ancestors lost and unnamed, to us, to you, to me, to the last upright ape still wandering the earth. It is humbling to realize that the story of humanity, the story we spend our lives trying to piece together, is built mostly out of gaps, not from the things that survived, but from the things that did not. For every bone that fossilized, for every footprint that hardened into stone, for every tooth that managed to outlast the bite of time itself, there are a million more that simply disappeared, gone before we ever arrived to ask the question. Which means that what we know about Lucy, about Australopithecus, and about all of human history is less a full story, and more a fragile conversation between what nature allowed to survive and what we are clever enough to find. This is the quiet truth of fossils. They are not the past itself. They are echoes. A bone does not tell us what happened. It tells us what survived happening. It is tempting to think of the fossil record as a library, a catalog of the creatures that once walked this planet. But it is more accurate to call it a whisper carried through sand, water, ash, and time. The process of becoming a fossil is not just rare. It is astronomically rare. Paleontologists sometimes call it the preservation lottery, a set of biological, geological, and planetary accidents that have to line up perfectly. You have to die in just the right place. You have to avoid being eaten, scattered, burned, or crushed. You have to be buried before scavengers or bacteria can erase you. Then your bones have to survive the unimaginable pressures of time, millions of years of shifting earth, water, and chemical change without dissolving completely. And even after that, someone has to find you, and that someone has to know what you are. So when we ask what Lucy was, when we point to her pelvis or her femur and say, "This proves bipedalism," we are standing on top of a mountain of assumptions, luck, and gaps. Not because the science is uncertain, but because the evidence is. And that is not failure. That is simply what it means to do science at the edge of deep time. The deeper you look, the more you start to realize that fossils do not just tell us about the past. They tell us about ourselves, about what questions we thought were worth asking, about what places we chose to dig, about what kinds of answers we were hoping to find. For much of the 20th century, the search for human origins was a search in all the wrong places. Many early scientists assumed, almost reflexively, that humanity must have come from Europe or Asia. After all, that is where the great civilizations were. That is where the universities were. That is where most of the scientists were born. So it seemed logical. But it was not logical. It was cultural bias disguised as science. It took the discovery of the Tong child in 1924, an upright walking, small-brained ancestor from South Africa, to begin unraveling that illusion. And even then, the scientific establishment spent decades dismissing it, calling it a fluke, a curiosity, not the real origin. It was not until the middle of the 20th century, with the work of Lewis and Mary Leakey in 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 Gorge, and finally the discovery of Lucy herself in 1974, that the center of gravity in paleoanthropology shifted back to Africa, where, of course, it had always been. But even that shift did not solve the problem of bias, because the fossil record does not care what we expect. It does not care what narratives we are hoping to confirm. It only cares about physics, chemistry, and time, which means that entire chapters of human history could have unfolded in places that left no trace, no fossils, no bones, no tools, only silence. Think about it. Today, the Great Rift Valley of East Africa is the epicenter of paleoanthropology. But why? Is it because that is where humanity actually began? Or is it because that is where geology happened to preserve the most bones? The Rift Valley is a rift, a place where tectonic forces tore the earth open, creating lakes, basins, and volcanic layers. Those conditions are ideal for fossilization. But other regions without that geology, dense forests, coastal plains, river deltas, might have been equally or even more important to human evolution, but left nothing behind. This is sometimes called the streetlight effect in science. Imagine a person searching for their lost keys under a streetlight, not because that is where they dropped them, but because that is where the light is. In paleoanthropology, the streetlights are the fossil-rich zones of East and South Africa. But the keys? The real story? That could be anywhere. This tension shows up not just in where we look, but in how we interpret what we find. For decades, scientists argued over whether Neanderthals were brutish, dumb, and primitive. Why? Because early Neanderthal fossils were compared to European ideals of beauty and intelligence. Broad brows, stocky bodies, and forward-projecting faces were misread as signs of inferiority. Only much later, as more evidence emerged, did we realize how wrong that was. Neanderthals were highly intelligent, complex, adaptive humans. Different from us, but not lesser. And the same danger applies to Lucy. It is easy to look at her small brain, about 400 cubic centimeters, and assume primitiveness. It is easy to see her long arms and think she was somehow halfway between ape and human. But that is not how evolution works. Lucy was not halfway anything. She was fully adapted to her world, fully competent in her time, not a prototype, not a mistake, but a creature who succeeded at the only thing evolution ever asks: survival. Her upright walking was not a foreshadowing of us. It was a solution to her environment. Her small brain was not a failure. It was what was needed at the time. If she had needed a bigger brain to survive, evolution would have delivered one. Eventually, it did, but not for another million years. When we project lines of progress into the past, when we imagine evolution as a ladder climbing toward Homo sapiens, we are not describing reality. We are describing ourselves, our own tendency to believe that we are the destination, the goal, the point of it all. But Lucy's bones remind us of something quieter, something humbler. Evolution has no goal. It is not moving toward anything. It is just what happens when life meets change. The irony, of course, is that even as we try to read fossils for objective truth, we cannot help but see ourselves in them. We name them: Lucy, Silam, Big Man, Artie. We sculpt their faces. We give them skin tones, eye colors, and expressions that reflect our own unconscious assumptions. We imagine their children, their fears, their deaths. And maybe that is not a flaw. Maybe that is part of how we make meaning, part of how we connect to the deep, deep past. But we should never forget the line between what the bones truly say and what we say about them. The bones can tell us that Lucy walked upright, that her species lived between 3,700,000 and 3 million years ago, that they ate a mix of savanna plants, roots, and occasional meat, that they were small-bodied, sexually dimorphic, and highly adapted to a mosaic environment of grassland and trees. But the bones cannot tell us whether she was afraid of crocodiles, whether she loved her children, whether she mourned her dead, whether she sat at the edge of a fire and watched the stars, wondering, like we do, where she came from. That part, that is the bridge between evidence and imagination. And it is a bridge that every paleoanthropologist, every scientist, and every curious human crosses, whether they admit it or not. So as we look at Lucy's tiny pelvis, her fractured ribs, her ancient footprints pressed into volcanic ash, we are not just looking backward. We are looking inward, at the strange, flawed, beautiful species that has spent 2 million years chasing its own reflection through the bones of the past. And that reflection? It is never quite complete, but it is always worth looking. Because the story the fossils tell is ultimately the story of us and South Africa. But the keys? The real story? That could be anywhere. There are few objects on this planet that carry the weight of an entire species. A crumpled flag on the surface of the moon, a photograph of the Earth seen from space, the Rosetta Stone, and for humanity's own body, one fragile skeleton, 47 bones, scattered by time, lifted from the soil in the dry heat of northern Ethiopia, and reconstructed into something more powerful than anyone could have guessed. A skeleton that stood for all of us. Her name is Lucy, or, as her own country calls her, Dinkinesh. You are marvelous. It is one of the strangest paradoxes of modern science. The fossil record is an accident. It is a chaotic lottery governed by geology, decay, and blind luck. It preserves almost nothing. Less than a whisper of life remains after deep time has had its way. And yet somehow, when a pile of shattered bones emerges from that abyss, we do not treat it as an accident. We turn it into a story, a mirror, a symbol of who we are or who we want to be. In the case of Lucy, that mirror became enormous. On the morning of the 24th of November 1974, when Donald Johanson spotted a fragment of fossilized humerus poking out of a dusty slope in Hadar, Ethiopia, he had no idea what he had just stumbled upon. Nor did Tom Gray, his graduate student companion, as they scanned the hillside together. Nor did any of their colleagues, as they gathered around the growing pile of bones back at camp, celebrating with beer cooled in the Awash River and a Beatles song echoing from the tape deck. A song that would give the fossil her name, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It was only in the following weeks, as the team realized the bones were all from a single individual, a rare, miraculous event in the fossil record, that the gravity of what they had unearthed began to sink in. And it was only over the next 5 decades that Lucy would cease to be a fossil and become an icon. But why her? Why did this one skeleton of a small-bodied, small-brained hominin from more than 3 million years ago become the poster child for human evolution? Why not one of the older fossils? Why not Artie, discovered in the 1990s, a million years older than Lucy? Or why not one of the many remarkable fossils found in South Africa or Kenya or Chad? The answer is a strange cocktail of timing, media, science, and perhaps something deeper, something about the human need for origin stories. Part of it was timing. The 1970s were a cultural pivot point for paleoanthropology. For much of the early 20th century, the story of human evolution was focused, wrongly, on Europe and Asia. The myth of the Piltdown Man had poisoned the field for decades with a fake British ancestor, later exposed as a hoax. Neanderthals and Homo erectus dominated the headlines. But by the mid-20th century, a new generation of scientists was beginning to correct that bias. Fossil discoveries by Lewis and Mary Leakey at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 Gorge were already shifting attention back to Africa. The discovery of the Tong child in 1924 had hinted that the cradle of humanity was not in Europe but in Africa. And by the 1970s, the evidence was overwhelming. Humanity was born on this continent. But no single fossil had captured that transition in such a clean, visceral way as Lucy. Her skeleton embodied something visual, something cinematic, that skull fragments or isolated teeth could not. 40% of her skeleton was there. A pelvis, a femur, a knee, a spine, a jaw. You could lay her out like a blueprint. You could stand her upright. You could look at her and, for the first time, see the precise moment where an ape stopped being an ape and had not yet become human. The media loved it. Cameras descended on Hadar, National Geographic ran spreads, documentaries followed. The fact that her name was Lucy, approachable, easy, almost childlike, made her instantly memorable in ways that fossil codes like AL288-1 never could. And the fact that her name came from the Beatles, one of the most universally recognized bands in modern history, sealed the deal. She was not just a fossil. She was a celebrity. But the iconography of Lucy was not just about pop culture. It was about what she symbolized to the science itself. For decades, a quiet but persistent debate had haunted paleoanthropology. Which came first, the brain or the biped? Did walking upright evolve because of our intelligence? Or was intelligence the consequence of a body that had already learned to stand? Charles Darwin himself, in the 19th century, had assumed that brain growth, tool-making, and bipedalism co-evolved in concert. Lucy shattered that assumption. Her brain was the size of a chimpanzee's, 380 to 500 cubic centimeters, and yet her hips, knees, and feet were unambiguous. She walked, upright, fully bipedal. That single fact rewrote textbooks. It told the world that the first big step toward humanity, quite literally, was not in the head. It was in the feet, in the legs, in the pelvis. Walking came first, the mind followed. And yet, it is here that the story gets complicated. Because in the decades that followed, the simplicity of that narrative began to fracture. More fossils emerged. Ardipithecus ramidus, dated to 4,500,000 years ago, showed evidence of both bipedalism and arboreal adaptations, challenging the clean transition from tree to ground. Kenyanthropus platyops complicated the picture further, suggesting multiple lineages experimenting with upright walking. And the more we studied Australopithecus afarensis itself, the more it became clear that Lucy was not fully like us. Her gait was different, her stride shorter, her body was still partially adapted to life in the trees. Even her status as a direct ancestor is now debated. Is she our great-great-grandmother or our great-great-aunt? Did her species lead directly to Homo, or was it a side branch? The truth is we still do not know, and we may never know. The fossil record is too broken, too incomplete, and yet despite these scientific uncertainties, Lucy's power as a symbol never faded. School children around the world know her name. Her cast stands in museums from London to Tokyo. Her photograph appears in textbooks on every continent. And the real bones, fragile, irreplaceable, are kept safe in a vault in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, visited only rarely by researchers. When U.S. President Barack Obama visited Ethiopia in the year 2015, he asked to see her. Standing before her glass case, he was told by paleoanthropologist Zeresene Alamseged, "Mr. President, she is the ancestor of every human being, including you." A pause, then a grin, even Donald Trump. And perhaps that is the core of it. In a world obsessed with division, with nations, races, borders, and lines, Lucy offers a quiet rebuke. She reminds us that there was a time when there was only one story, one origin, one fragile species, upright in a dangerous world, carrying the seeds of everything to come. But even as she became that symbol, it is important to remember what she is, and what she is not. Lucy is not the first, she is not the last. She is a snapshot in a vast, messy, branching river of evolution, a river with many channels, dead ends, and forks. And her preservation is not destiny, it is luck. Had her bones not been buried in just the right sediment, at just the right moment, had erosion not revealed them at just the right angle to the eye of a passing scientist on a hot afternoon in 1974, the world would have never known her. How many other Lucys are out there, still waiting under the earth? How many stories have been lost, not because they were unimportant, but because the geology was unkind? The fossil record is not the full story. It is not even close. It is a fragment of a fragment, a street lamp in the darkness. We look where the light happens to fall. And yet, what a thing it is that the light fell on her. Lucy is not the beginning. She is not the end. But she is the bridge, a small body, 47 bones, standing in the long twilight between ape and human, between memory and oblivion, between the deep past and the strange, uncertain future that her distant descendants now inhabit. She walked, and the world changed. Not because she knew where she was going, but because walking itself, that improbable, awkward, utterly consequential act, was the first step toward everything. And that is why Lucy still stands, not in flesh, not in muscle, but in memory, as a fossil, as an icon, as a mirror in which we all, every single one of us, can still catch a glimpse of where we began. Imagine standing before a slab of ancient stone, staring down at a footprint, not a shoe, not a sandal, a bare foot, pressed into soft volcanic ash by something very small, very upright, and very ancient. A being who, just for a moment, walked like you, who may have looked nothing like you from the neck up, but whose steps still mirror yours. It feels like science fiction, but it is not. It is a fossil. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 footprints, a message from the deep past, a simple step, frozen forever in time. 3,700,000 years ago, a volcano erupted in what is now northern Tanzania, dusting the savanna in a thin sheet of ash. It was the kind of eruption that is not quite catastrophic, but enough to blanket the landscape like gray snow. Rain fell shortly after, transforming the powder into something like wet cement. And then, for a brief window, hours, maybe days, a parade of animals crossed the surface. Elephants, giraffes, guinea fowl, antelopes, and 3 hominins, 3 upright apes, walking, leaving behind a trail of footprints that would, against all probability, survive not just the elements but millions of years of time itself. The 𝐓𝐈𝐿 footprints are not just evidence of presence. They are evidence of something much larger, of a turning point in the story of life on Earth. They are the oldest direct physical proof that, by this time, at least some of our ancestors had fully committed to walking on 2 legs. Not occasionally, not part-time, full-time, terrestrial, upright walking. The kind of walking that made hands free, spines curved, hips tilted. The kind of walking that would change everything. This shift, bipedalism, is one of the strangest evolutionary gambles ever made, because walking upright is not, by any metric, an easy design. 4-legged animals are far more stable, far faster, far better balanced. Walking on 2 legs costs energy to stabilize. It stresses knees, it damages spines, it narrows birth canals, it comes with a long list of evolutionary costs. And yet, something about this trade-off was worth it. Worth the broken hips, the slipped discs, the wobbly toddlers. And it all started with footsteps like these. Footsteps left by creatures like Australopithecus afarensis. the same species as Lucy. And as we've seen, Lucy's skeleton proved that her kind walked upright. But the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐿 Toly are something else. They are not bones, not theoretical reconstructions. They are behavior, fossilized. They are the act of walking itself, evidence not just of anatomy, but of how that anatomy was used. The prints tell a lot. Their gait is clearly bipedal. The pressure falls on the heel first, rolls through the ball of the foot, and pushes off at the toe, just like you. The big toe is aligned with the others, not splayed out to the side like in chimpanzees. There is an arch to the foot, suggesting a spring in the step. There is no doubt about it. Whoever made these prints was walking in a way functionally very close to a modern human. And yet, the stride length is short. The step spacing is close together. This was a small-bodied walker. One adult is followed by a smaller adult or juvenile, and a third, even smaller figure trailing behind. Perhaps a family, a mother and child, or two adults and a young one. We cannot know. But the image is hauntingly familiar. They are moving together, coordinated, side by side, as humans have done ever since. And this is where the real story begins, because a footprint is not just evidence of walking. Walking is not just a way to move, it is a way to be. Upright walking set in motion a cascade of anatomical, behavioral, and eventually cultural revolutions. Free hands meant the possibility of tool use, long before tools were invented. An upright posture changed how we viewed the world, eyes higher off the ground, able to scan for danger or opportunity. But the costs were immediate. Narrower hips made childbirth harder. Spinal alignment caused chronic back pain, a price still paid by billions today. The foot evolved to absorb impact, but became vulnerable to sprains, strains, and fractures. No other species on Earth has voluntarily committed to this peculiar, fragile mode of movement quite like us. We are the upright ape. Not because it is easy, but because, at some pivotal moment in evolutionary history, it worked. And here is where the echoes stretch beyond the Pliocene, because that same posture is the one that eventually allowed us to carry tools, to gesture, to throw spears, to build fires, to climb mountains, to cross oceans, to plant cities, and eventually, to sit in chairs and ask questions like, why did we ever stand up in the first place? From 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼 to New York, from footprints in volcanic ash to footprints on the moon, the line is not broken. When Apollo astronauts stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, they left footprints in powdery dust that may last millions of years, just like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼. Footprints on the moon, footprints in Tanzania, both artifacts of the same peculiar evolutionary mistake, the decision to rise onto two legs. There is something poetic here, something humbling. To think that one of the defining traits of being human, our ability to move through space in this absurd balancing act, is recorded not just in bones, but in footprints, and that those footprints can outlive their makers by millions of years. Scientists are still debating exactly how Australopithecus afarensis moved. Was it a perfectly efficient walker like us, or a compromise between ground and tree? Some argue the 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼 prints show a bent hip, bent knee gait, less efficient than ours. Others insist it was nearly modern. The debate continues, and it should. Science is not about answers, but about better questions. But what no one debates is this: walking came first, before tools, before fire, before language, before minds as we know them, before agriculture, before cities, before religion, before writing, before the internet, before the spacecraft that carries this story into your ears now. The decision to stand upright reshaped the trajectory of life itself. No other adaptation has so thoroughly rewired the body, the mind, and eventually the planet. And it began with beings like Lucy, and footprints like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼. Even the format of this documentary, the very fact that you are sitting or lying down, listening to this, or maybe driving somewhere perched upright in your car seat, is a direct consequence of that evolutionary shift. Your spine aches because of it. Your feet tire because of it. Your hands are free to hold a phone, a spoon, or a steering wheel because of it. This podcast, in a very real sense, exists because some ape in East Africa chose, by some accident of biology, to walk. The footprint echoes. The first step never fades. And as we close this chapter, staring back across nearly 4 million years, The only reasonable thing left to say is this: stay curious, stay calm. Because this story is not over. It is still unfolding every time you take a step. It is a strange thing to admit that the single most important evolutionary leap in the story of humanity was an accident. A strange, irreversible, utterly improbable accident, and one that will almost certainly never happen again. Of all the traits that define what it means to be human, the capacity for language, the mastery of fire, the engineering of tools, the ability to look up at the night sky and wonder what it means, none of it would have been possible without the strangest gamble in mammalian history. A body that stood up, permanently, for all of time. A body that would never again be comfortable on all fours. A skeleton that could no longer climb trees the way its ancestors had for tens of millions of years, and whether it wanted to or not, it had committed its lineage to walking. It began long before Lucy, long before her bones fossilized in the sediment of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 triangle. Somewhere between 4 million and 7 million years ago, something shifted. Something subtle, something quiet. There was no great ceremony, no lightning strike of consciousness, just a slight adjustment of the angle of the pelvis, a femur that leaned inward, pulling the knee under the body's center of mass, a foot that began to lose its thumb-like grasping toe, and a spine that curved just enough to balance the head over the hips. No single individual ever woke up and thought, "Today I shall become bipedal." Evolution does not think like that. It does not plan. It does not forecast. It simply tinkers, generation after generation, with tiny anatomical bets that either work or do not. But what makes this moment, the rise of upright walking, so utterly unique in the entire history of life on Earth is not just how strange it is how permanent it became. This was not a behavior that could be casually switched on and off. It was not like swimming or flying or burrowing, strategies that different species have independently evolved, abandoned, and reinvented countless times over hundreds of millions of years. Bipedalism, the full commitment to walking on two legs, has appeared precisely once in the entire history of the mammalian class. Once. And it never reversed. Not in us. Not in any lineage that committed to it. No ape that ever began this journey ever went back to knuckle walking. No proto-human that leaned into this gamble ever evolved back into a quadruped. From Sahelanthropus in the Miocene, to Orrerin, to Ardipithecus, to Australopithecus, and finally to Homo. The path only moved forward. Slight tweaks appeared. Some lineages retained a bit more climbing ability. Others became better distance runners. But the core blueprint, an upright, habitual walker, was locked in. There was no way back. And that is the great evolutionary irony, because in many ways, it was a terrible idea. Walking upright is biomechanically inefficient compared to quadrupedalism in certain ways. It places enormous strain on the lower back. It compresses vertebrae. It increases the risk of slipped discs, hernias, and arthritis. Our knees suffer under the constant weight. Our feet develop plantar fasciitis, bunions, and stress fractures. And, most famously, it radically complicates childbirth. The narrow pelvis required for efficient upright walking squeezes the birth canal to the point that humans have one of the most dangerous and painful birthing processes of any species on Earth. It is worth pausing here to reflect on that fact. Every human birth is an echo of this trade-off. A moment where a body engineered for walking must pay the price in agony, danger, and risk to both mother and child. No other primate gives birth like this. No chimpanzee, no gorilla, no orangutan. This is a uniquely human burden, a burden that began with that first evolutionary step, and that has echoed ever since. So why? Why did it happen? Why did a lineage of forest apes gamble everything on a body plan that sacrificed so much? The honest answer is, we do not fully know. Not yet. Perhaps we never will. But the best theories suggest a confluence of pressures. Climate was changing. Forests were shrinking. The expansion of open grasslands across East Africa created new selective pressures. A body that could stand upright could see farther over tall grasses. It could spot predators earlier. It could move between shrinking patches of trees more efficiently. And it freed the hands, an accidental but world-changing byproduct. Hands that were no longer needed for walking could now carry food, children, sticks, or stones. Over time, those hands would shape the world itself. But it was not inevitable. This is the part that matters. Nothing about this was destiny. Evolution is not a ladder. It does not climb toward some preordained goal. It is a blind, local process, tinkering with what works in the moment. And for most of Earth's history, upright walking was not part of the solution. Out of the billions of species that have ever lived, only one became fully committed to bipedalism. And even within the apes, we were the outlier. Gorillas did not do it. Orangutans did not do it. Chimpanzees flirted with occasional bipedal walking but remained comfortably quadrupedal for everything else. Only our lineage, alone, took the step that could not be undone. And once it happened, the doors it opened were profound. An upright body can carry things. It can use tools more effectively. It can migrate long distances. It can throw. No quadrupedal animal can throw with the force, precision, or distance that humans can. Our shoulder anatomy, freed from the constraints of weight-bearing locomotion, became a catapult, a dangerous, precise, ballistic engine for hurling projectiles. First rocks, then spears, then missiles, then spacecraft. Follow the chain long enough, and a single fossilized footprint at Laetoli leads, with perfect logical brutality, to a boot print on the moon. One step becomes another, becomes a migration out of Africa, becomes a city, becomes a rocket, becomes a telescope staring back into the origins of the universe itself. But it also locked us into a body that could never return to the trees, never scurry like a quadruped again, never reverse what evolution had committed to. The first step was the last step, in the sense that there was no turning back. The moment the pelvis tilted, the femur angled, and the foot lost its grasping toe, the die was cast, forever. And it will never happen again. Not on this planet, not in this evolutionary window. Because every branch of life has already chosen its path. The mammals that could have become bipedal did not. The apes that could have joined us did not. The dinosaurs that once flirted with bipedality are long gone. No other lineage on Earth today is anywhere near committing to full-time upright walking. It is simply too deep an evolutionary trench to cross. Could something like it happen on another world? Perhaps. Somewhere out there, under a red sun or a blue one, perhaps there is a lineage of creatures with knees tilted inward, with spines curved against gravity, with pelvises widened just enough to shift the center of mass over the feet. Perhaps. But here, on this world, never again. This is what makes the fossil of Lucy so strange, so powerful, and so humbling. It is not simply the skeleton of an extinct ape. It is a monument to the singularity of this path, a path that led directly to us, a path that could only be walked, never climbed back. Look at her pelvis. Look at her femur. Look at the way the bones curve, not by choice but by history. Her bones are the scaffolding of every skyscraper, the footprint under every wheel, the shadow cast by every monument humanity has ever built. They are the price of being who we are. And so the first step echoes. From Laetoli to Hadar, from Hadar to the Nile, from the Nile to Mesopotamia, from there to Rome, to Beijing, to Tenochtitlan, to New York, to wherever you are, right now, sitting, standing, walking, or perhaps lying down, listening to this. Whether you are driving through the night, folding laundry, cooking dinner, or falling asleep. You are a biped, and that is forever. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for stepping out of the noise, for drifting into the deep, slow rhythms of prehistory, for remembering that our story is older, stranger, and more fragile than anything we were ever taught. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you quiet your mind for a little while, thank you for being here. This is a small corner of the internet, where knowledge still wins, where curiosity still matters. And if you think more people should know this story, if you think the story of Lucy, of Dinkinesh, deserves to echo a little further, you already know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe, wherever you are, whenever you are, or somewhere in this world I can only imagine. Thank you. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.